The room was eerily silent, the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful but suffocating. Parker Pyne adjusted his glasses, his sharp eyes scanning the dimly lit study. A single flickering lamp on the oak desk cast long shadows across the room. The faint aroma of aged leather and ink lingered in the air, but something else was present too, something metallic, sharp, and unmistakably sinister. His gloved fingers trailed over the surface of a mahogany desk until they stopped abruptly at a small object. A tiny thread of crimson led his gaze to a tall vintage fountain pen. But this wasn't just any pen. A single bead of blood clung to its nib, threatening to drip. "Curious," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible, but his mind raced. Suddenly, a creak echoed through the air. Parker turned his head sharply. The door behind him, which had been ajar moments ago, was now completely shut. He leaned back slightly, a flicker of something resembling fear but more akin to calculation crossing his face. Someone was here, watching, waiting. Then came the sound. A faint rustling, like a whisper, but no words could be made out. Pyne's heart didn't quicken. He was far too seasoned for that. Instead, he slipped his hand into his pocket and retrieved a small notebook, his fingers brushing against something elsy, cold, metallic object he had tucked away for moments like these. "Show yourself," he said calmly, though his voice carried the weight of command. The silence that followed was deafening, but Parker knew better than to trust it. He took a deliberate step forward, his polished shoes tapping lightly against the hardwood floor. His gaze darted to the window. The curtains swayed slightly, though no breeze had touched them. Then he saw it. In the reflection of the antique mirror on the wall, there was movement, a shadow, tall and looming, standing right behind him. What happens next? Does Parker confront the shadow, or is it already too late? What secrets does the pen hold? And most importantly, who is playing this sinister game of cat and mouse with him? The room was cloaked in shadows, illuminated only by the dim glow of a single lamp on the mahogany desk. Maria Packington sat hunched in the large leather chair, a half-empty glass of wine cradled in her hands. Her gaze was fixed on a faded family photograph propped up against a stack of unopened letters. In the picture, she and her husband George stood side by side, their smiles radiant and carefree. But that moment, captured so vividly on paper, felt like a relic of another life, a taunting echo of a happiness that now seemed unattainable. Maria's thoughts swirled like the wine in her glass. The house was too quiet now, except for the faint, muffled sounds of laughter from the radio in the other room. George used to laugh like that, she thought bitterly. But lately, his laughter seemed reserved for someone else, Nancy, the young and overly efficient typist who now occupied more of his time than Maria ever could. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the glass tighter, a storm of emotions threatening to burst forth. How had it come to this? Was it her graying hair, the lines that crept onto her face when she smiled? Or had George simply grown tired of her? The questions gnawed at her, each one more painful than the last, leaving wounds that even time couldn't heal. The radio crackled suddenly, breaking through the suffocating silence. A deep, melodious voice filled the room. "Are you happy? If not, consult Mr. Parker Pyne." Maria's brow furrowed, her breath hitching. The words seemed to hang in the air, refusing to be dismissed as mere advertising drivel. She turned her head slightly, listening intently as the voice repeated the message. Happiness guaranteed, it promised. All inquiries treated with absolute confidentiality. The wine glass trembled in her hand, the liquid inside catching the faint light, as if reflecting the tumult within her. Happiness. When was the last time she'd even thought about the word? It felt foreign, like a language she no longer understood, a concept reserved for the young and the naive. Her mind raced with questions. Who was this Parker Pyne? Could he really help someone like her? Or was it just another empty promise designed to lure in the desperate? And yet, she couldn't shake the strange pull of those words as though they had been meant for her, a beacon cutting through the fog of her despair. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windowpane, jolting Maria from her thoughts. She set the glass down with a soft clink, and stared at the photograph once more. The smiles looked almost mocking now, a cruel reminder of everything she had lost. The voice on the radio continued, fading into static before being replaced by a cheerful tune that felt out of place, almost surreal against the backdrop of her turmoil. But the seed had already been planted. Maria leaned back in her chair, the flicker of an idea sparking to life in her weary mind. What if? The question loomed large, both thrilling and terrifying. What if happiness was still within reach? What if she dared to hope again? Outside, the laughter on the radio grew louder, mingling with the mournful howl of the wind. The room seemed to darken further, the shadows stretching long and ominous, as if warning her of the risks ahead. Yet, for the first time in years, Maria Packington felt a glimmer of something she couldn't quite name hope, or perhaps the prelude to something far more dangerous. The fading light cast ghostly shapes across the room as Maria whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the wailing wind. "Who are you, Mr. Pyne?" The unconventional savior. Maria stepped into the small but tastefully decorated office, her nerves a tangled knot of anticipation and doubt. The room was unlike any she had imagined. Instead of the clinical sterility of a therapist's office or the imposing grandeur of a lawyer's chambers, this space radiated an understated elegance. Warm wood paneling, plush armchairs, and a single vase of white lilies on a side table lent it a peculiar air of comfort, and yet something about it felt meticulously staged, as though every detail had been chosen to evoke a precise response. "Mrs. Packington, please have a seat," came a voice, smooth and assured. Maria's eyes snapped to the man standing by the desk. Parker Pyne. He was not at all what she expected. His appearance was unremarkable, a stout man in a well-tailored suit, with thinning hair and kind yet unreadable eyes. And yet, there was something about him, an aura of quiet command that made her feel as though she had stepped onto a stage and he was the playwright, already familiar with every line she might speak. She sat cautiously, her fingers clutching her handbag like a lifeline. Pyne settled into the chair opposite her, steepling his fingers as he regarded her with a faint, enigmatic smile. "You heard the advertisement on the radio," he began, his voice calm but probing, as if he already knew the answer. Maria nodded, her throat dry. "Yes. I don't know why I am here, really. It sounded so odd." "Odd," Pyne echoed, his eyebrows lifting slightly. "Not desperate, not intriguing." His words hung in the air, daring her to contradict him. Maria shifted uncomfortably under his gaze, feeling as though he could see past the careful facade she had constructed for herself. "Perhaps both," she admitted finally. Pyne's smile deepened, though his eyes remained inscrutable. "Desperation and intrigue often go hand in hand, Mrs. Packington. Tell me, what do you want?" Maria hesitated. The question was deceptively simple, but the way he asked it made her feel as though her entire future hinged on her answer. "I want to save my marriage," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course you do," Pyne said smoothly, as though her response was both inevitable and irrelevant. "But let me ask you this. Are you willing to take the risk?" "Risk?" Maria repeated, startled. "What risk?" "Every solution comes with its own cost," he replied, leaning forward slightly. His tone was gentle, but carried an undercurrent of something darker, a hint of warning. "Sometimes it is a small price, sometimes it is more than one is prepared to pay. But nothing worth having is ever truly free." Maria felt a chill run through her. She couldn't tell if his words were meant to reassure her or unsettle her. There was something about him that defied categorization. He seemed kind, even compassionate, but there was a glint in his eyes that hinted at calculation, as though he viewed her not as a person but as a puzzle to be solved. What exactly do you plan to do?" she asked cautiously. Pyne's smile returned, mysterious and impenetrable. "I have my methods, Mrs. Packington. They are unconventional, yes, but effective. If you follow my instructions to the letter, I assure you, you will see results." Maria's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She wanted to trust him, to believe that he could help her. But there was something in his demeanor, an air of control so absolute that it was almost unnerving. He spoke as though he were orchestrating a grand performance, with her as a mere player in his design. "I don't know if I can," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I don't even know if I should." "Doubt is natural," Pyne said, rising from his chair and moving to stand by the window. He looked out at the street below, his hands clasped behind his back. "But let me ask you this. How long can you continue as you are now? How long before the loneliness becomes unbearable?" His words struck a nerve, and Maria felt tears prick her eyes. She hated how easily he had seen through her, how effortlessly he had voiced the fears she had tried so hard to suppress. "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice shaking but resolute. Pyne turned back to her, his smile returning. "Good. Then we begin." As Maria left the office, a strange mix of hope and unease churned within her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had just made a deal with a man who knew far more than he let on, a man who might be her savior or her undoing. Transformation, the game begins. Maria stared at her reflection in the mirror, her heart sinking at the sight. The pale, tired woman looking back at her felt like a stranger. Dark circles clung stubbornly beneath her eyes, her hair hung limp and lifeless, and her shoulders slumped as if weighed down by invisible chains. This was the woman George no longer looked at, the woman whose presence had faded into the background of her own life. But Parker Pyne's instructions had been clear. Trust the process. And so she had reluctantly shown up at the boutique he had arranged, unsure whether to feel hopeful or foolish. The transformation began in a flurry of motion. A stylist with a cascade of auburn curls and an infectious smile ushered her into a chair, declaring, "We're going to bring out your sparkle, darling." Maria wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, but the woman's enthusiasm was contagious. As hands worked swiftly, applying creams, trimming her hair, and selecting fabrics with an artist's precision, Maria felt her doubts begin to waver. Each small change brought a ripple of unexpected emotion. When the stylist framed her face with soft waves, Maria glimpsed a version of herself she hadn't seen in years. When a sales assistant draped a deep sapphire dress against her, its rich hue accentuating her eyes, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't dared to feel in ages: pride. "You have such a graceful neck," one of the attendants murmured as she adjusted a delicate string of pearls. Maria blinked, startled. When was the last time anyone had complimented her? The final reveal came with a sense of theater. The stylists and assistants gathered behind her, their smiles eager as they turned her toward the full-length mirror. Maria's breath caught in her throat. The woman standing there was radiant. Her hair shone with vitality, framing a face that seemed to glow with warmth and confidence. The sapphire dress hugged her figure in all the right places, the pearls adding a touch of elegance. For the first time in years, Maria saw herself not as the shadow of the woman she used to be, but as someone vibrant, alive. The emotion hit her like a wave. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of release, of rediscovery. She thought of the years she had spent feeling invisible, of the laughter that had slipped away, of George's indifferent glances that had hollowed her out. And now, here she was, reclaiming the pieces of herself she had thought were lost forever. When she stepped out of the boutique onto the bustling street, the world around her seemed to transform as well. The gray clouds that had hung in her mind felt as though they had parted, revealing a brighter, more vibrant world. Colors seemed sharper, the air fresher, the sounds of laughter and chatter a melody she hadn't noticed before. As Maria walked, heads turned. She felt their gazes, some admiring, some curious, and instead of shrinking away, she lifted her chin, her steps growing steadier with each stride. Confidence, she realized, was intoxicating. It wasn't just the dress or the pearls or the perfect hairstyle. It was the knowledge that she mattered, that she was worth seeing. By the time she reached the small cafe where Parker Pyne had instructed her to meet him, Maria was no longer the woman who had stared forlornly at her reflection that morning. She stepped inside with an air of quiet assurance, her smile as luminous as the chandelier above her. For the first time in years, she felt the intoxicating thrill of being alive, and it was just the beginning. Mysterious Claude entry. The soft hum of violins filled the Grand Hotel ballroom as Maria Packington stood at the edge of the dance floor, her sapphire dress catching the light like ripples on water. She still wasn't entirely comfortable with the transformation that had turned heads all evening, but the thrill of being noticed was undeniable. "May I have this dance?" The voice was deep, smooth, and tinged with an easy confidence. Maria turned to see a man standing before her. His sharp suit tailored to perfection, his dark hair slightly tousled in a way that seemed deliberate yet effortless. He smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips that made her heartbeat quicken. "Claude Luttrell," he said, extending his hand. His grip was warm, firm, and just the right side of lingering. "Mr. Pyne sent me. He thought you might enjoy some company tonight." Maria's cheeks flushed, but she managed a composed nod. "Maria Packington," she replied. His name sounded exotic, like it belonged to someone who had secrets and stories to tell, and Maria couldn't help but be intrigued. As they moved onto the dance floor, Maria felt a surge of confidence she hadn't experienced in years. The orchestra swelled, and Claude led her expertly through the waltz, his touch light but commanding. He leaned in, his voice low. "You've captivated the entire room, you know. But I doubt anyone else here could match your elegance." She laughed softly, the sound unfamiliar yet welcome in her ears. "I think you are exaggerating, Mr. Luttrell." "Claude," he corrected with a wink. "And no, I am not. You are remarkable, Maria. Anyone with eyes can see that." For a moment, she let herself believe him. She felt radiant, cherished, even desired. The evening unfolded like a dreamer's easy charm, the way he seemed attuned to her every word, the way he made her laugh like she hadn't in years. Yet there was something in his gaze, a flicker that she couldn't quite place. Was it admiration, or something darker? They ended the night on the hotel's balcony, the city lights sprawling below them. Maria leaned against the railing, the cool breeze brushing against her skin as Claude handed her a glass of champagne. "You are different from what I expected," he said, his tone softer now, tinged with something that sounded like regret. Maria tilted her head. "What did you expect?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the glass in his hand. The easy charm that had defined him all evening seemed to waver, replaced by an unsettling vulnerability. "Someone untouchable," he admitted. "But you are not. You are real, and that makes what I have to say even harder." The violins inside played a slower, melancholic tune now, as if echoing the sudden shift in the air. Maria's chest tightened. "What is it, Claude?" He set his glass down, his hands gripping the railing as if steadying himself. "Maria, that here is something you need to know about me. I've made mistakes, big ones. I've lived my life as, well, let's just say I've been paid to be charming, to make women feel special." The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. She stepped back, her mind racing to piece together what he was saying. "Are you saying this tonight? Was it all just part of your job?" she asked, her voice trembling. Claude turned to face her, his eyes earnest but shadowed. "It started that way, yes. Parker Pyne hired me to help you, to show you how extraordinary you are. But somewhere along the way, Maria, it became more than that." Her breath caught. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, but so was the sting of betrayal. "How can I believe you?" He reached for her hand, his touch tentative. "You don't have to. All I can say is that you've changed me, and that's not something I've ever experienced before." The music inside seemed to fade into the background as Maria pulled her hand away. She turned back to the city lights, her thoughts a whirl of emotions: anger, sadness, confusion, and something even more dangerous. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but her words carried the weight of the evening's revelations. "Maybe you have changed, Claude. Or maybe this is just another part of the act. Either way, thank you. Because tonight, for the first time in years, I felt alive." She walked away before he could respond, leaving him alone on the balcony, the weight of his confession lingering in the night air. As she stepped into the elevator, Maria's heart ached with unanswered questions. Was Claude's love real, or just another illusion crafted by Parker Pyne? And did it even matter if, in the process, she had rediscovered herself? Jealous husband encounter. The ballroom shimmered with golden light, the chandeliers casting a warm glow over the polished floor, where couples swayed to the rhythm of a lively waltz. Maria Packington, resplendent in a deep emerald gown that accentuated her newfound confidence, glided across the floor in Claude Lutterell's arms. Her laughter rang out, light and carefree, as he whispered something charming into her ear. For the first time in years, she felt alive, desirable even. George Packington stood stiffly at the edge of the room, a glass of scotch in his hand. His eyes burned as they followed Maria's every movement. Beside him, Nancy, his young and vivacious typist, prattled on about something inconsequential, her hand resting possessively on his arm. But George barely heard her. His focus was entirely on the woman who used to fade into the background of his life but now commanded the room's attention. "She looks different," Nancy remarked, her tone laced with an undercurrent of annoyance. George didn't respond. His jaw tightened as he watched Claude lean in, his face too close to Maria's for comfort. The way she smiled at him, the way she seemed to glow under the ballroom lights, sent a wave of something unfamiliar coursing through him. Was it jealousy? Regret? He couldn't tell, but it was unbearable. As the music swelled, Maria and Claude spun past George and Nancy. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met. Maria's gaze lingered, steady and unflinching, before she turned back to her partner, her lips curling into a smile that felt like a challenge. George's grip tightened around his glass. "I need some air," he muttered, brushing past Nancy and striding toward the exit. The confrontation came later that night, in the quiet tension of their living room. Maria's gown still shimmered under the dim lights, a stark contrast to George's disheveled appearance. He had been pacing, his tie loosened, and his face flushed with anger. "What the hell was that?" he snapped, breaking the silence. "Dancing with that man, laughing like a schoolgirl. Are you trying to humiliate me?" Maria's response was calm, almost detached. She walked over to the mantel, adjusting a vase of fresh flowers, as though his outburst were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "Humiliate you?" she echoed, her voice smooth and measured. "Tell me, George, how does it feel?" He froze, caught off guard by her tone. "What's that supposed to mean?" She turned to face him, her eyes piercing. "For years, I've watched you parade around with Nancy, acting as though I didn't exist. You didn't care how I felt then, so why do you care now?" George opened his mouth to retort but found himself at a loss. Maria's gaze held him in place, her calm confidence disarming him in a way he hadn't anticipated. "I wasn't trying to humiliate you," she continued, her voice softening but losing none of its strength. "I was simply enjoying myself, something I haven't done in a very long time." The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. George sank into a chair, the fight draining out of him. He stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time in years. This wasn't the timid, mousy wife he had grown accustomed to. This was a woman reborn, radiant and self-assured. "Maria," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. But she held up a hand, silencing him. "Good night, George," she said simply, turning on her heel and leaving the room. As the door clicked shut behind her, George was left alone with his thoughts. The image of Maria's smile, the sound of her laughter, and the sight of her dancing with another man played on a loop in his mind. For the first time he realized what he had taken for granted, and for the first time he felt the sting of being left behind. Shocking confession, Claude. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the quiet park where Maria and Claude walked side by side. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of blooming jasmine, but Maria barely noticed. Her heart was light, a sensation she hadn't felt in years, and it was all because of the man walking beside her. Claude's laughter had a way of filling the silence between them, his charm effortless and intoxicating. He spoke of art, of music, of places she'd never been but now longed to see. With him, Maria felt seen, heard, alive. Yet tonight, there was something different about him. His usual breezy confidence was replaced with a quiet tension that Maria couldn't quite place. "Claude," she said softly, halting their stroll. The moonlight danced in her eyes as she looked up at him. "What's on your mind?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the cobblestones beneath their feet. For a moment, the man who always had the perfect words seemed utterly lost. Then he exhaled, the sound heavy with resignation. "Maria," he began, his voice low and rough around the edges, "here is something you need to know about me, something I should have told you from the start." Maria's heart fluttered, but not with the usual excitement Claude stirred in her. This was different. There was a weight in his tone that sent a shiver down her spine. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked at her then, his eyes filled with a vulnerability she had never seen before. "I haven't been honest with you about who I am," he confessed. "Before I met you, my life was complicated. I wasn't always the man you see now." Maria's brow furrowed, confusion mingling with a creeping sense of dread. "What do you mean?" Claude stepped closer, his hand brushing hers, as if seeking solace in her touch. "I used to be a gigolo, Maria," he said, the words tumbling out like stones. "I made a living by entertaining wealthy women, offering them companionship in exchange for money. It wasn't something I was proud of, but it's who I was." The world seemed to tilt beneath Maria's feet. She stared at him, struggling to reconcile the man she had come to trust and admire with the one he was describing. "Why are you telling me this now?" she managed, her voice trembling. Claude's expression softened, his eyes searching hers. "Because you deserve the truth. You deserve better than me. I can't let you build your happiness on a foundation of lies." Maria's breath hitched as the realization hit her. "You are leaving, aren't you?" He nodded, pain etched into every line of his face. "It's for the best. You've come so far, Maria. You don't need me to feel alive. You are stronger than you think, and I won't let my past taint your future." The silence that followed was deafening. Maria felt a storm of emotions raging within her: betrayal, sadness, and an ache she couldn't quite name. Yet beneath it all, there was something else: clarity. "Did you ever care about me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Claude's hand reached for hers, and for a moment she let him take it. "More than you'll ever know," he said, his voice breaking. "That's why I have to go." The confession lingered in the air long after Claude walked away, his silhouette swallowed by the shadows of the park. Maria stood there, her heart heavy but her mind strangely clear. For all the pain his words had caused, they had also given her something she hadn't expected: a sense of self. Later, she would learn the truth: that Claude's confession had been orchestrated by Parker Pyne, a final act in his elaborate plan to ensure Maria found her worth not in the affections of a man, but in herself. Yet in that moment, as she turned to leave the park, Maria didn't need to know. All she knew was that she was no longer the woman she used to be. The stars overhead seemed brighter somehow, their light cutting through the darkness, and as Maria walked away, she felt an unfamiliar sensation blooming in her chest. Not heartbreak, not despair, but something far more profound: resilience. Climactic reunion, George. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the Packington residence, casting a warm golden glow over the freshly polished floors and carefully arranged furniture. George Packington sat in his study, staring blankly at the letter he had written and rewritten a dozen times. The words on the page blurred together as memories of Maria flashed through his mind: her laughter, her quiet strength, and the way she used to light up a room. He had taken it all for granted. Last night at the ballroom, something inside George had shifted. Seeing Maria with Claude, her face alight with a confidence and joy he hadn't seen in years, had sent a jolt through him. It wasn't just jealousy, it was regret. a deep, gnawing regret for the way he had let their marriage crumble. For the first time, he saw her not as his wife, the woman he had grown used to, but as a person with dreams, desires, and a life outside of him. George's grip tightened around the pen as he scrawled a single line at the bottom of the letter. "Maria, I am sorry." It wasn't enough, he knew, but it was a start. In the dining room, Maria was arranging a vase of fresh lilies. Her movements were deliberate, almost meditative, as she placed each flower with care. She had slept soundly for the first time in months, her dreams free of the turmoil that had once plagued her nights. Pyne's words echoed in her mind. Happiness is not given, it's claimed. She had claimed hers, and for the first time she felt whole. When George entered the room, she didn't flinch or shrink back as she might have before. Instead, she looked up and met his gaze with steady eyes. He hesitated, his usual air of authority replaced with an unfamiliar vulnerability. "Maria," he began, his voice low and uncertain. I owe you an apology." She raised an eyebrow, her hand still cradling a lily. "Do you?" Her tone was calm, but there was an edge to it, a strength he hadn't expected. George swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her scrutiny. "I've been a fool. I let my pride and my selfishness blind me to what really matters. Seeing you last night, so radiant, so alive, it made me realize how much I've lost, how much I've taken you for granted." Maria set the lily down and folded her arms. "And what exactly do you want from me, George? Forgiveness, a second chance. Why now?" Her questions were direct, cutting through the air like a blade. George's shoulders sagged under their weight. "I want to make things right," he said. "Not because I feel obligated, but because I care about you, Maria. I always have. I just forgot how to show it." Maria studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched, filling the room with an almost palpable tension. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "George, I've changed. I am not the woman who waited in the shadows for you to notice her. I've found my own light now, and I won't let anyone dim it again, not even you." George nodded slowly, a flicker of pain crossing his face. "I understand, and I don't want to dim your light, Maria. I want to be worthy of it." Her lips curved into a small, bittersweet smile. "That's a start." As they stood there, the sunlight streaming between them, the moment was charged with unspoken possibilities. It wasn't a sweeping declaration of love or an instant reconciliation. It was something more fragile, but perhaps more real, the tentative first step toward rebuilding what had been broken. In the background, the faint strains of a melody drifted in from the radio, a tune about second chances and the courage to begin again. Maria turned back to her lilies, her movements calm and deliberate, as George stood watching her with a newfound respect. For the first time in years, their home felt less like a battleground and more like a place where hope could take root. Closing twist. Pyne note. Weeks had passed since the grand transformation of Maria's life. The quiet suburbs were once again filled with the sounds of morning routines, chirping birds, rustling newspapers, and the hum of distant chatter. Maria, seated by the large bay window, sipped her tea with a serenity she hadn't known in years. George sat across from her, buried in his newspaper, but there was something new in the air between them. A kind of respect, a silent acknowledgement of a bond rekindled. As she flipped through her own paper, her eyes caught a familiar name. It was a small entry tucked into the personal column, yet it stood out like a beacon. "To the woman who reminded me of my worth. Thank you, I've chosen a new path, Claude." Maria's breath caught. A faint smile touched her lips, but it wasn't one of triumph or longing. It was one of understanding. Claude's words were as much for her as they were for himself. She folded the paper, setting it aside, her thoughts drifting back to Parker Pyne. His name, his presence, his uncanny ability to see through the veils people wore. How much of this her reconciliation, her newfound confidence, her clarity was her own doing, and how much of it was his orchestration? She glanced at George, who had lowered his paper and was watching her. "What is it?" he asked softly, his tone uncharacteristically tender. "Nothing," Maria replied, though her mind was racing. George was here, present, and willing to try. But the cracks of the past still lingered, faint. She wondered if they could ever truly bridge them, or if they had only found a way to paper over. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room, Maria found herself holding the business card Parker Pyne had given her. The embossed letters gleamed. She turned it over, noticing for the first time, "Happiness is a puzzle, Mrs. Packington. The pieces are yours." A chill ran down her spine, not from fear but from the weight of his words. She looked out the window, half expecting to see him standing there, watching with that knowing smile. But in a modest office across the city, Parker Pyne leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smile playing on his lips. "Another happy client," he murmured, though his eyes held a glint. Was it pride, amusement, or something darker? Even he might not have. The camera pans back to Maria, who sits by the window with the card still in her hand. Her expression is thoughtful, her smile. The room feels warm, inviting, but the air carries a Was this happiness truly hers, or had it been? The scene fades to black as Maria whispers, "Happiness, do we create it, or does someone else?" What happens when boredom meets danger? This is the story of a soldier, a mysterious woman, and a secret that could change lives forever. The room was still, save for the soft tick of the clock on Major John Carter's desk. The weight of the evening settled on his shoulders as he leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the letter in front of him. The paper was aged, yellowed at the edges as if it had traveled through time itself to reach him. But it was the strange cryptic symbol scrawled across the page that sent a chill down his spine. It wasn't just the bizarre markings. This wasn't the first cryptic message he'd received. No, it was the words beneath them. "Your past hides a treasure and a curse. Find it before they do." His fingers tightened around the edges of the letter, as if the words themselves had a hold on him. He had seen more than his fair share of danger in his career: war zones, covert operations, and enemies that never quite stayed dead. But this was something different. Something personal. The message was a ghost from his past, a past he had long buried under layers of military protocols and unspeakable secrets. But now, it seemed, those secrets were coming back to haunt him. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see a ghostly figure standing in the doorway. But the room remained empty. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence: a soft, almost imperceptible tap against the window. Carter's heart skipped a beat. He slowly turned his gaze toward the window. His breath hitched. There, barely visible through the thick curtains, was the unmistakable shadow of someone standing just outside. A rush of adrenaline shot through him. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor with an audible screech as the figure outside shifted and disappeared from view. His mind raced. Was it a mistake? Or had someone been watching him? He moved toward the window cautiously, his military instincts kicking in. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the realization that something had shifted. The world he'd known had just been upended by a single piece of paper. The message on the letter echoed in his mind. "Find it before they do." He pressed his palms to the cool glass, peering out into the growing darkness. Nothing. But Carter knew this was just the beginning. Whoever they were already hunting him, and time was running out. "Stay where you are," the man barked, his voice low and guttural. Freda's face paled, but she didn't flinch. Carter's mind raced. He recognized the type: mercenaries, probably hired by someone with a lot to lose. They were here for the treasure. And they weren't leaving without it. "Get up," the man ordered, waving the gun toward the exit. But Carter wasn't about to follow orders. He glanced at Freda, seeing the fear in her eyes and a flash of something else: determination. She wasn't going to go down without a fight. Neither was he. With a sudden, fluid motion, Carter grabbed the coffee pot from the table and hurled it toward the man closest to him. The boiling liquid splashed across his face, momentarily blinding him. The man screamed in pain, stumbling backward. "Go!" Carter yelled, pushing Freda toward the back door. But as they moved, another of the masked men lunged forward, knocking Freda off balance. Carter reacted instantly, swinging a fist into the man's jaw, sending him crashing to the floor. The third man, undeterred, opened fire. The bullet whizzed past Carter's shoulder, narrowly missing. Freda gasped, her face a mask of terror, but Carter didn't stop. He grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the door with all his strength. "Run!" he shouted. They dashed out into the alley, their footsteps echoing in the narrow, dimly lit passage. The sounds of pursuit grew louder behind them, but they couldn't afford to look back. The world was closing in, and they had no choice but to run. As they rounded a corner, Carter spotted an old delivery van parked in the shadows. Without hesitation, he yanked open the door, shoving Freda inside before climbing in himself. The engine roared to life, and they sped away, the pursuit momentarily lost in the rain-soaked streets. Freda was breathless, her eyes wide with shock. What the hell was that? Who were they? Carter gritted his teeth, slamming the van into gear. "Doesn't matter. They're part of the same group who wants what we're looking for, and they'll keep coming until we're dead." Freda looked out the back window, her voice shaky. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" Carter didn't answer. Instead, he drove faster, the city lights blurring into streaks. There was no turning back now. They had just crossed into a game where the stakes were life and death. As the van sped into the night, a chill settled in Carter's gut. They had barely escaped with their lives, but the real danger was just beginning. And whatever it was that Freda's father had discovered, it was more than just treasure. It was a curse that would follow them to the ends of the earth, unless they could uncover its secrets first. The hidden past cliffhanger. The revelation. The dimly lit apartment smelled of dust and old paper, the weight of forgotten years thick in the air. Carter moved quietly through the room, his gaze scanning the various papers and personal effects that had once belonged to Freda's father. He didn't want to be Heronot with the memories it stirred up, and not with the mounting pressure to find answers, but Freda had insisted. "This is it," Freda said quietly from the corner of the room, her voice barely above a whisper. She was standing by a wooden desk, a desk cluttered with old books and a scattering of maps. The kind of maps that Carter had seen before, maps that only the most desperate of men would be hunting for. Maps that could lead to something far more valuable than money, a truth long buried. Carter approached her, his heart hammering in his chest. They had been piecing together fragments of clues for days now, each one pulling them deeper into a web of lies. But this could be the break they needed. She gently unfurled a weathered piece of parchment, her fingers tracing the faded ink. It was a map, but not just any map. This one had markings that made Carter's breath catch in his throat. They were too familiar. The coordinates, the place on the map. It was a location tied directly to his past, a place he had hoped never to revisit. His throat tightened. "Where did you find this?" Freda didn't answer immediately. She seemed lost in the map's details, her fingers lingering on the spot where the ink had worn thin. Finally, she looked up at him, eyes searching his face as if looking for answers he wasn't willing to give. "My father. He knew about this place, this location. He was obsessed with it, Carter. But he never told me why. I think he thought it would kill him if he did." Carter's mind raced, but he couldn't bring himself to speak. The memories of that place, the mission in Africa, came rushing back in a flood of guilt and fear. What had he done? And how was Freda's father involved? Then, as if the universe had decided to push him to confront his demons head-on, Freda pulled out another item from the Pyne old photograph. The edges were frayed, the image faded by time, but it was unmistakable. Freda held it up, her eyes narrowing with disbelief. In the photo, a much younger version of Carter stood alongside Freda's father. They were in uniform, standing side by side, smiling at something off camera. But there was something wrong about the image. Freda's father, despite the smile on his face, seemed uneasy, his eyes darting to the side, as if aware that something was closing in on him. Freda's voice broke through the silence. "Why didn't you tell me you knew my father?" Carter stiffened, a cold sweat breaking out along his spine. He'd known Freda's father. Of course he had, but he had never mentioned it. Why would he? It was a part of his life. He had read a chapter he'd closed the moment he left Africa, a chapter full of shadows and unanswered questions. "I didn't think it mattered," Carter said quietly, his voice strained. Freda's eyes widened, the words burning with accusation. "You knew him. You were there. And you never told me. Why, Carter? What else are you hiding?" Carter swallowed hard, his mind racing for an explanation that wouldn't sound like an excuse. He wanted to tell her the truth, but could he? Could he open that door? The door to the guilt that gnawed at him every night, the guilt over what had happened during that mission, and the possibility that Freda's father had been one of the casualties of a decision Carter had made years ago. He looked at her, the weight of her question hanging in the air like a thick fog. "It's complicated," he muttered, his eyes dropping to the floor. "Things didn't go as planned, Freda. A lot of good men. They didn't come back. And your father, he was one of them, I thought." "What did you think?" Freda interrupted, her voice rising. "That I wouldn't want to know. That I wouldn't deserve to understand what happened to him." Carter's jaw tightened, and for a moment he couldn't speak. He had known this moment was coming, but he hadn't prepared for how much it would hurt to face the truth. He had promised to protect her, to keep her out of this. But now, as Freda stood before him, eyes blazing with a mixture of hurt and anger, he realized how much he had underestimated her. She shook her head, her voice trembling with emotion. "You've been lying to me, haven't you? Keeping things from me, and I don't know if I can trust you anymore." A silence fell between them, thick with tension. Carter could feel the fragile thread of trust they had built over the last few days beginning to snap, and with it, his hopes for solving this mystery with her. She wasn't just a partner in this hunt. She was a person he had come to care about, and now that bond was in jeopardy. He wanted to reach out to her, to explain everything, but the words wouldn't come. His past was too heavy, too dark to drag into the light. Freda took a step back, shaking her head, her eyes still locked on him. "I need answers, Carter. I don't know if I can keep going with you if you are hiding the truth. All of it. You owe me that much." The room seemed to close in around them, the weight of their unresolved tension suffocating the air. Carter felt the guilt crush him from the inside out. He had always known this moment would come. He had known that the truth would come out eventually. But he wasn't prepared for how it would feel to see Freda look at him with distrust in her eyes. As Freda turned and walked toward the door, Carter's chest tightened, his fingers brushing the edge of the map they had uncovered together. The location. The place that had been the catalyst for everything that had gone wrong. He wasn't sure if he could fix this, if Freda would ever forgive him, but one thing was certain. The past was coming back for both of them, and it wouldn't stop until the secrets were fully uncovered. Cliffhanger. The trust between Carter and Freda is broken, leaving them on the precipice of an emotional and moral chasm. Carter stands at the crossroads of his past and present, unable to escape the guilt that haunts him. And Freda, now uncertain of his motive, steps out of the room, leaving him with the haunting question: can they ever rebuild what was lost? Twists and tension, the double cross. Carter and Freda had placed their trust in Daniel Harper, an old friend of Carter's from his military days. A brilliant cartographer and seemingly reliable ally, Daniel was the one who deciphered the map's symbols and promised to guide them to the treasure. But as the trio made camp at an abandoned railway station near the treasure's suspected location, Daniel seemed distracted, constantly glancing over his shoulder and fidgeting with his pack. That night, as the fire crackled softly and Freda dozed off, Carter noticed Daniel was gone. The sound of rustling footsteps outside confirmed his fears. Grabbing his revolver, Carter followed the faint glow of a lantern into the dense forest. He caught a glimpse of Daniel hunched over the map, muttering to himself. "Daniel," Carter called out, gun drawn. "What the hell are you doing?" Daniel froze, clutching the map to his chest. "Two can't do this, Carter," he stammered. His eyes darted around nervously. "They're watching us. They've been watching me. If I don't do what they say, I am dead." "What are you talking about?" Carter demanded, his voice a low growl. "Who's watching you?" Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he threw a small, crumpled piece of paper at Carter's feet and bolted into the darkness. Carter's instincts screamed to chase him, but the chilling weight of Daniel's words rooted him to the spot. Back at camp, Carter unfolded the note under the dim lantern light. Written in shaky, hurried handwriting were the words, "I had no choice. They're watching me. Don't trust anyone." Freda, now awake and alarmed, joined Carter. Her eyes scanned the note before flickering to him. "What does he mean by this? Who are they?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Carter replied, though his tone lacked conviction. He folded the note and shoved it into his pocket. His mind was already racing, retracing every step of their journey, every person they had spoken to, and every shadow that had crossed their path. But the past wasn't done haunting him. Later, as they sifted through Daniel's belongings in search of clues, Freda pulled out an old photograph from a weathered notebook. Her face turned pale as she studied it. The photograph showed her father standing next to a group of men in uniform. Among them was a much younger Carter, his arm slung casually over her father's shoulder. "Why didn't you tell me you knew my father?" Freda's voice was sharp, almost accusing. Carter hesitated, guilt pooling in his chest like lead. "It was a long time ago," he admitted. "He was part of the same mission in Africa, but I didn't know him well." "That's not what this picture says," Freda snapped, holding it up. "You look like friends. Did your mission have something to do with his disappearance?" "I don't know," Carter said firmly, though even he wasn't sure if it was the truth. Memories of that fateful mission, shrouded in secrecy and regret, surged to the surface. He remembered the orders to secure the area, the chaotic firefight, and the local informant who had vanished under mysterious circumstances. Was it Freda's father? The tension between them crackled like static in the air. Freda's trust in Carter began to erode, and Carter's own doubts gnawed at him. As the night stretched on, the forest seemed to close in around them, the distant sound of rustling leaves and snapping twigs serving as a constant reminder they weren't alone. The stakes had never been higher, and now the question wasn't just about who they could trust, but whether they could even trust each other. Danger rises, trapped in the flooded vault. The abandoned building loomed over Carter and Freda like a sentinel of secrets, its crumbling walls whispering of long-forgotten betrayals. The air was damp and thick with decay as they pushed through the rotted wooden door. Inside, the faint scent of mildew mingled with the metallic tang of something older, something hidden. "It has to be here," Carter murmured, holding up the battered map Daniel had decoded before his betrayal. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating broken furniture, collapsed beams, and shattered glass. Freda followed close behind, her every step crunching against debris. "This place feels like a tomb," she said under her breath. "That's because it is," Carter replied grimly. "These places were built to protect, but they can just as easily trap." They found the vault hidden beneath a trapdoor in the floor. Rusted hinges groaned as Carter heaved it open, revealing a narrow stone staircase spiraling into the earth. The air grew colder and more oppressive with each step they descended, their breath visible in the faint glow of their flashlights. At the bottom, they found it. A massive iron vault door stood before them, its surface etched with symbols matching those on the map. Freda ran her fingers over the carvings, her pulse quickening. "This is it, isn't it?" Carter nodded, his jaw set. "Let's hope it was worth all this trouble." The door creaked open after a painstaking process of aligning the symbols, a combination of logic, luck, and sheer determination. Inside was a chamber that seemed untouched by time. Stacks of gold coins glinted in the light. Ancient artifacts were arranged on pedestals, and at the center sat a chest adorned with intricate carvings. Freda gasped, "It's beautiful." But Carter's instincts screamed danger. He scanned the room, noting faint grooves in the floor, a suspiciously smooth ceiling, and the faint scent of something chemical. "Don't touch anything yet," he warned. Too late. Freda had already stepped inside. The moment her foot crossed the threshold, a low rumble echoed through the chamber. "What was that?" Freda asked, panic creeping into her voice. Carter cursed under his breath. A trigger. The door slammed shut behind them with a deafening clang, and a hiss filled the air. Water began gushing from hidden spouts in the walls, cascading over the floor and pooling around their feet. "Carter!" Freda cried, her voice rising with fear. "I see it," Carter shouted, already searching the room for a way out. The water was rising fast, sloshing around their ankles, then their knees. "Is there a release mechanism? A hidden lever?" Freda asked, frantically scanning the walls. Carter was already at the chest, prying it open with his knife. Inside, among the treasure, was a lever hidden beneath false panels. "This has to be it," he muttered, pulling the lever. Instead of stopping the water, it doubled the flow. "Carter, we're going to drown here." Freda's voice broke as the water reached her chest, icy and relentless. "Not if I can help it." Carter snapped, his mind racing. He spotted an air vent high on the wall, but it was too small for them to climb through. The ceiling above showed faint cracks, weak points. "Help me," he yelled, grabbing a metal pole from the treasure pile and aiming it at the ceiling. Freda, trembling but determined, joined him. Together they rammed the pole upward again and again, water surging higher with every strike. Finally, the ceiling gave way, a cascade of rubble falling into the chamber. Light streamed in from above, and Carter boosted Freda up through the narrow opening before hauling himself out, gasping for air. They collapsed on the ground outside, soaked and shivering, as the sound of water gushing below echoed ominously. Freda turned to Carter, her face pale but her eyes blazing. "We almost died down there." Carter stared back, his face hard. "But we didn't, and now we know just how far they'll go to keep this secret buried." As they sat in the cold light of dawn, the vault's treasure felt less like a prize and more like a curse. And somewhere in the shadows, Carter knew, their enemies were watching. The climactic escape, the final betrayal. The night was alive with danger. Carter and Freda crouched behind a crumbling stone wall, their breath visible in the cold, moonlit air. The distant roar of the syndicate's engines reverberated through the valley, growing louder by the second. "They're closing in," Freda whispered, clutching the treasure map to her chest. "I know," Carter replied, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling around them. He glanced at his watch, then at the narrow bridge spanning the gorge ahead. It was their only way out. "What's the plan?" Freda asked, her tone tinged with both desperation and trust. Carter met her eyes, his gaze firm. "We're going to give them exactly what they want us." Before she could question him further, Carter grabbed a satchel filled with rocks and debris, identical to the one containing the real treasure, and sprinted toward the bridge. Freda followed reluctantly, her instincts screaming that something was amiss. As they reached the bridge, the sound of the engines morphed into headlights piercing the darkness. Men armed with rifles poured out of the vehicles, their shouts echoing off the canyon walls. "There they are. Don't let them escape." Carter and Freda darted across the bridge, but halfway across, Carter stopped abruptly. He handed Freda the map. "Keep running," he ordered. "What? No, I am not leaving you," she protested. "Just trust me," he said, his voice soft but unyielding. Then, without another word, he yanked a detonator from his pocket and pressed the trigger. The explosion was deafening, ripping through the night as the bridge crumbled into the gorge below. Freda screamed as she stumbled forward, the blast throwing her to the ground. When she turned back, the bridge was gone along with Carter. For a moment the syndicate stood in stunned silence, their quarry seemingly dead. Then, one by one, they began to retreat, muttering curses about a treasure lost forever. Freda sat there, trembling, staring into the void where Carter had been. But before despair could take hold, a hand clamped over her mouth from behind. "Shh," Carter's voice whispered in her ear. "It's me." She spun around, her relief quickly replaced by anger. "You faked your death." "Had to," he said with a smirk, pulling her to her feet. "It's the only way to get them off our trail." Freda punched his arm. "You idiot. You scared me half to death." But her relief was short-lived. As they made their way to a nearby hideout, a small cabin tucked into the forest, something nagged at Freda. Carter was too calm, too focused. And the satchel he carried didn't look like it was filled with rocks anymore. Once inside, Freda rounded on him. "What's in the bag, Carter?" He froze, his eyes betraying the slightest hint of guilt. "Nothing you need to worry about." Her voice rose, cutting through the tension. "Show me." Carter sighed, setting the satchel on the table and opening it. Inside, the glint of gold and the shimmer of jewels confirmed her worst fears. "You lied to me," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of betrayal and fury. "You had the treasure all along." "I had to," Carter replied, his tone defensive but not unkind. "If they thought we had it, they'd never stop chasing us. This was the only way to keep you safe." Freda shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "Was this ever about the truth? About my father? Or was it always just about the treasure?" Carter stepped closer, but she backed away, her trust shattered. "Freda, listen to me. This treasure is more than gold. It's proof evidence of the syndicate's crimes. Your father died trying to uncover this. I am trying to finish what he started." But Freda wasn't convinced. She grabbed her coat and stormed toward the door. "You keep your treasure, Carter. I am done being a pawn in your game." As she disappeared into the night, Carter stood alone, the weight of his choices pressing heavily on his shoulders. He glanced at the treasure, then at the map she'd left behind. He whispered to himself, "It's not over yet." Outside, unseen by either of them, the faint glow of a cigarette lit up in the darkness. A shadowy figure watched from the tree line, a sinister smile spreading across his face. The game was far from over, and the stakes were about to get much higher. Resolution: Parker Pyne's letter. The morning was gray and cold, the kind that seeped into your bones and made every breath feel heavier. Carter stood at the train station, his coat buttoned tightly against the chill. He watched as Freda climbed into the carriage, her expression unreadable. Neither of them spoke the words they wanted to, and the silence between them felt like a chasm that no bridge could span. As the train's whistle blew and it began to pull away, Carter took a step forward, as if to call her back, but stopped himself. Instead, he reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the worn edges of the treasure map she'd left behind. The treasure wasn't worth it if it meant losing her, but now it was too late. Freda, seated by the window, watched the station recede into the distance. Her hand rested on her lap, trembling slightly. She hated the way they'd parted so much left unsaid. But what hurt more was the feeling that perhaps she'd never really known him at all. Hours later, as the train sped through the countryside, Freda opened her handbag to retrieve her journal. Tucked between the pages, she found an envelope that hadn't been there before. Her name was written in elegant cursive on the front. At the same time, in his small London apartment, Carter placed his coat on the back of a chair and froze. An envelope sat on the desk, addressed to him in the same neat handwriting. Both opened their envelopes simultaneously, miles apart, but connected by the same thread of intrigue. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the message short but loaded with meaning. "Your happiness was the treasure all along. Until we meet again, Parker Pyne." Carter's brow furrowed as he read the words. His mind raced. Parker Pyne. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but he couldn't place it. Was this some kind of joke? Or another layer to the mystery he thought he'd unraveled? Freda, too, stared at the note in disbelief. "Parker Pyne," she murmured aloud. Then it hit her. She'd read about him as self-proclaimed expert in happiness and solving life's dilemmas. But what did he have to do with her and Carter's ordeal? As if on cue, both Frida and Carter noticed something else in their envelope piece of photograph. Frida showed her father standing next to Carter's commanding officer, both men smiling and holding a small, ornate chest, the treasure she and Carter had risked everything for. Carter's photograph, however, was far more chilling. It showed a group of men from his mission in Africa, all marked with red crosses over their face except for him. Scrawled across the bottom were the words, "This isn't over." Frida clutched the photo tightly, her pulse quickening. Was this a clue, a warning, or something more sinister? Carter, meanwhile, leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning. Parker Pyne, was he an ally, or another player in this dangerous game? And who was behind the threats that refused to let him go? Both felt a strange mix of unease and curiosity. The treasure they'd uncovered seemed insignificant compared to the storm brewing just beyond their reach. As the scene faded to black, the sound of a typewriter filled the air, the rhythmic clacking echoing like a heartbeat. In a dimly lit office, a man sat behind a desk, his face obscured by shadows. He folded his hands over a stack of letters identical to the ones Carter and Frida had received. A sly smile spread across his face as he murmured to himself, "Oh, my dear players, the game has only just begun." The screen cut to black, leaving the audience breathless with anticipation for what might come next. The last twist, the real threat. Carter sat at his kitchen table, the soft hum of the city outside the only sound breaking the silence. The events of the past weeks had finally begun to feel distant, almost like a strange dream. The treasure, Frida, the betrayals, it all seemed like a story he'd heard rather than lived. For the first time in days, his body relaxed. He reached for his coffee when a knock at the door startled him. Frowning, Carter stood and approached cautiously. Through the peephole, he saw no one. Opening the door, he found only a brown envelope on the mat, addressed to him in blocky handwriting. Curiosity tinged with unease, Carter took it to the table and opened it. A single photograph slid out. His breath caught in his throat. The photograph was old, grainy, and unmistakable. It showed a group of men, his unit from the Africa mission. They stood shoulder to shoulder, dusty uniforms bearing the scars of the desert. But someone had altered the photo. Each face, save his own, was crossed out with thick, red ink. The red lines felt violent, like slashes of rage, and a chill ran down Carter's spine. Beneath the photo, scrawled in the same red ink, were 3 words: "You're next." Carter's hand trembled as he dropped the photo onto the table. His eyes darted to the window, scanning the street outside. Was someone watching him right now? He thought about the photograph's message, the men who had once been his comrades, and the dangerous secrets that had long been buried in the sands of Africa. His heart raced as memories came flooding back. He saw their faces, heard their laughter, felt the bond they had shared. But he also remembered the mission, how it had gone wrong, how decisions were made that couldn't be undone. Was this a warning, revenge, or something even darker? Just then, his phone buzzed. A new message popped up from an unknown number. It wasn't about the treasure. It's about the truth. Look closer. The words sent a fresh wave of unease coursing through him. Carter stared at the photo again. He grabbed a magnifying glass and scanned every inch of it. That's when he saw it, something barely noticeable in the background. A shadowy figure, blurred but present, standing just behind the group. It hadn't been there in the original photograph. Of that he was certain. A single thought chilled him to the bone. Was it the same figure Frida had spotted that night at the vault? Carter leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. And now, it seemed, the stakes were higher than ever. He stared at the photo once more, his mind racing with questions. But one burned brighter than the rest. Who's coming for me, and why? As the screen fades to black, the photograph remains in focus, the red ink glaring against the aged paper. A faint whisper echoes, barely audible. It's always been about the truth. For the audience, what do you think Carter's past holds? Is it revenge, betrayal, or a secret darker than we've yet imagined? Let us know your theories, because the next chapter might just hinge on what you uncover. A woman walks into Parker Pyne's office with a diamond ring, claiming she's in danger. But the truth, it's even darker than you could imagine. It was a gray, unremarkable afternoon in London, the kind that slips by unnoticed, lost in a haze of drizzle and routine. Parker Pyne sat at his desk, idly flipping through a stack of correspondence, the dull hum of rain against the window pane the only companion to his thoughts. It was the kind of day when even mysteries seemed to take a rest. Then the door burst open. A woman stumbled in, dragging the storm with her. Her coat was drenched, her auburn curls clinging to her face, and in her trembling hand was a diamond ring, its brilliance a stark contrast to the shadows in her eyes. "Two need your help," she stammered, her voice cracking with desperation. Her gaze darted around the room as though she expected someone or something to follow her in. Parker Pyne rose slowly, his sharp eyes narrowing as he took her in. She wasn't just anxious, she was terrified. Women of her station didn't barge into offices unannounced, rain-soaked and wild-eyed, unless they were running from something for someone. "Sit down," he said firmly, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. She hesitated for a moment, then sank into it as though her legs could no longer support her. The ring in her hand caught the light, scattering tiny rainbows across the walls. "It's all gone wrong," she murmured, clutching it so tightly her knuckles turned white. "I thought I could fix it on my own, but now—" Her words caught in her throat, and she glanced over her shoulder at the closed door. Pyne leaned forward, his voice calm but commanding. "Start from the beginning, Mrs. St. John," she whispered, her eyes brimming with tears. "Daphne St. John." She paused, her lips trembling, before finally meeting his gaze. "And if I don't fix this, I don't know what will happen to me." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken dread. Pyne waited, letting the silence draw her out. "I stole this ring," she blurted, thrusting it forward as though it burned her. "And if anyone finds out, it'll ruin me. My marriage, my reputation, everything." Pyne's brows lifted, but he said nothing, his practiced silence encouraging her to continue. "It's not just the ring," she added, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It's what it means, what I've done, what they know." She leaned forward, her eyes pleading. "I am being watched, Mr. Pyne. I can feel it. Please, you have to help me." Outside, the rain lashed harder against the window, as though the storm itself had taken an interest in her plight. Pyne studied her for a moment longer before finally speaking. "All right, Mrs. St. John," he said softly, his voice steady as a lighthouse in the gale. "Let's untangle this mess, shall we?" And with that, the ordinary afternoon dissolved into a labyrinth of lies, danger, and betrayal, with Parker Pyne stepping into the eye of the storm. Daphne's fingers trembled as she set the diamond ring down on the desk between them, its polished surface catching the light in a way that almost felt like mockery. She stared at it for a long moment, her breath shallow and uneven, before she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lady Naomi Dortheimer," she began, the name falling from her lips like a curse, "is my friend, or at least I thought she was." She forced herself to look up, meeting Pyne's gaze. "I've done something terrible, Mr. Pyne. Her eyes flickered with a mixture of guilt and fear, and for a moment it seemed as though the words would fail her. Pyne leaned forward slightly, his expression unchanged but his mind already piecing together the puzzle. He had seen desperation like this before, but it was never less striking, never less dangerous. "I took this ring," Daphne continued, her voice shaking as she clasped her hands tightly together. "I took it from Naomi. I swapped it out with a paste copy and pawned the real one to pay off some debts." There it was, the secret that had been eating at her for weeks, the lie that had spiraled out of control. Pyne watched as she gulped down a breath, her eyes darting nervously around the room, as though she expected someone to burst in at any second. I had no choice, she muttered, her voice suddenly hoarse. The gambling started as a bit of fun, but then it took over. My husband has no idea. Naomi doesn't know. Nobody knows. But I am drowning, Mr. Pyne. Drowning in my own mistakes. The silence that followed her confession was thick, suffocating even. Pyne's mind clicked into motion, running through the possibilities, the dangers, the webs of deceit now entangling the young woman before him. "Why the ring?" Pyne asked, his voice level, but his eyes sharp. "Why not something else?" Her lips trembled as she answered, "Because it was Naomi's most prized possession, a gift from her late husband. I knew it would be easy to pawn, and I needed the money quickly more than I'd ever admit to anyone. It seemed like the perfect solution." She ran her fingers through her hair, eyes wide, as though the pressure of the truth was suffocating her. "But now I can't return it. Naomi's husband and mine, that here has been a falling out. They don't speak, they don't even look at each other anymore. And Naomi is furious with me. If she finds out what I've done, it will be the end of everything. My marriage, my life, it's all hanging by a thread." Pyne sat back in his chair, his expression thoughtful as he absorbed the gravity of the situation. Daphne was trapped not just by her actions, but by a network of lies, betrayals, and a friendship that seemed to be falling apart at the seams. "But you have a way out, don't you?" Pyne's voice cut through the tension, calm and measured. "You wouldn't be here asking for help if you didn't." Her eyes flickered with something, hope, maybe, or desperation, or both. "I thought I could get the ring back, but it's too dangerous now. Naomi wants to reset the diamond, and if that happens, the truth will be out. I can't risk it." She leaned forward, her voice barely audible, as though confessing her sins to the very air itself. "That's why I am here. You are my last hope, Mr. Pyne. Please, fix this for me." The air between them crackled with tension. Daphne's secrets were no longer just her own, they were now part of something larger, darker. The storm outside seemed to echo the chaos within her. Pyne considered her for a long moment, then stood up, walking to the window and gazing out at the rain-lashed streets below. The puzzle was starting to form in his mind, the pieces falling into place with a clarity that had eluded Daphne. But just as he was about to speak, the door creaked open, a subtle sound, almost imperceptible, but enough to make both their hearts race. Daphne's eyes snapped to the door, her breath caught in her throat. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Pyne turned slowly, his face as unreadable as ever. "You are being watched, Mrs. St. John," he said quietly, as the door slowly clicked shut behind them. Daphne's blood ran cold. The feeling that had been gnawing at her, the sensation of eyes on her, of danger lurking just beyond her reach, was no longer a distant fear. It was here, in the room with them. The storm outside raged on, but inside the office, a different kind of storm was just beginning to brew. Web of deception. The silence in Pyne's office was deafening as Daphne slowly sank into the chair, her fingers gripping the armrests as though she could somehow steady herself against the storm inside her. The diamond ring, a symbol of her desperate gamble, glinted softly in the dim light of the room, but to Daphne it felt like a weight, pulling her deeper into a pit of guilt she couldn't escape. She took a long, shaky breath before she spoke again, her words tumbling out in a rush, as though they were suffocating her from the inside. "I've been living a lie for months now, Mr. Pyne." Her voice trembled as she paused, eyes flicking nervously to the ring. "My husband, Georgie's a good man, a careful man. He has no idea what I've been doing." Pyne watched her carefully, his mind already processing every word she said. He knew there was more. There always was. Daphne's gaze dropped to her lap, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "I've been gambling, Mr. Pyne, more than I should. The casino in Le Touquet, the one with the glittering lights and the promises of easy fortune, it had me. At first it was just a way to unwind. A little fun, a little risk, nothing serious. But then it took over. I couldn't stop." She clenched her hands into fists, as though she were trying to contain the rage she felt toward herself. "I kept it hidden from George. from everyone. I'd tell him I was out shopping, or at a friend's house. But every night, I was at that damn casino, betting what little money we had left. She swallowed hard, as though the admission physically hurt. I lost it all, Mr. Pyne. The money, the savings, even the small inheritance I had left from my father. Everything was gone. Pyne's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing that there was a deeper layer to this story, a deeper lie woven into the fabric of her confession. Daphne's voice faltered, but she pressed on. Then came Lady Naomi's ring, the one you see before you. She looked up at him, eyes filled with regret. It was the perfect solution. Naomi is so proud of that ring, her late husband's gift. She'd never part with it willingly, and I knew that. Daphne's lips twisted bitterly. So I swapped it. I found a perfect replica no one would ever know. I took the real diamond and pawned it in Paris. All that money gone in a single night. Pyne's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to form a clear picture. But just as quickly, another thought struck him. There was more to this than just gambling debts. Something else lingered beneath the surface, something Daphne wasn't saying. I am assuming that here is more to this story, Pyne said, his voice steady but probing. Why the sudden need to reclaim the ring now, after everything you've done? Daphne hesitated, her eyes darting around the room as though the answer could be found in the shadows. She exhaled slowly, then leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. My cousin Edmondy passed away a month ago, and with his death, I've inherited a sum of money. Enough to pay off my debts, to reclaim the ring, and to make everything right. She clenched her hands together, her nails biting into her palms. But here is a problem. Naomi, she's suspicious. I can feel it. She knows something's off, but she can't prove it, and I can't return the ring now. Not after what I've done. She looked up at Pyne, her eyes pleading. I am trapped. The past is closing in on me, Mr. Pyne, and I don't know how to get out of it. A flicker of realization passed over Pyne's face. She had thought her cousin's inheritance would be the answer, but it had only complicated things further. Now she was tangled in a web of lies, not just about the ring, but about the very fabric of her life. And this isn't just about the money, is it? Pyne asked, his voice cutting through the tension. Here is more at stake here than you are willing to admit. Daphne's lips trembled as she looked away. You don't understand. It's not just the ring. Naomi and I are families, we've been through so much. I am afraid that if she finds out what I've done, everything will fall apart. She'll ruin me, Mr. Pyne. She'll expose me for the liar I am. She swallowed hard, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the clock on the wall. It seemed to echo louder with every passing second, amplifying the weight of her words. The pieces were falling into place, but Pyne knew that Daphne was still hiding something crucial. The question wasn't just about the ring anymore. It was about why she had gone so far to keep it hidden, why she couldn't bring herself to tell George the truth. I'll help you, Mrs. St. John, Pyne said finally, his voice calm but with an edge of something darker beneath it. But you need to tell me everything, no more secrets. Daphne's eyes widened with fear, but she nodded. The storm outside raged on, but the storm inside her seemed even more dangerous, more volatile. The deeper they went, the more she realized that there was no easy way out. She had stepped into a game where the stakes were much higher than she could have imagined, and the truth was the last thing anyone would want to uncover. The twist of the conflict. Daphne's hands trembled as she gripped the arms of the chair, her knuckles white. Pyne's office felt suffocating now, the air thick with unspoken secrets. She had told him most of the truth, perhaps too much, but there was still one final, horrifying layer that she had kept hidden. And it was this very layer that was pushing her toward a precipice she didn't know how to avoid. You don't understand, Mr. Pyne, Daphne said, her voice growing strained. I can't return the ring. Not now, not after what happened. Pyne leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with curiosity. There was something more, something that still hadn't clicked in this increasingly tangled puzzle. Why? What's stopping you? She hesitated, her lips quivering as she met his gaze. But then she broke, her words tumbling out in a rushed whisper. My husband, George, and Lady Naomi's husband, Danielthe, had a falling out. A terrible one, over business, over something that neither of them will admit. It's been going on for months, and no one knows what caused it, only that it's so deep now, so bitter, that no one is willing to speak to the other. The confession hung in the air, but Daphne wasn't finished. Naomi doesn't even look at me the same way anymore. She knows I am hiding something, but she doesn't know what. Her hands wrung together, twisting as though they were still trying to undo the mess she had created. She's already suspicious. If I were to return that ring to her now, if she found out what I had done. She closed her eyes as if picturing it, the horrifying image too much to bear. Naomi will expose me. She'll tear my life apart. She'll never forgive me. Pyne watched her, his expression unreadable, but inside his mind raced. There was more here than just a simple case of theft. This was about far more than a diamond ring or debts at a casino. There were lives, reputations, and relationships hanging in the balance. Daphne's fear wasn't just about being caught. It was about the destruction of everything she had worked so hard to build. The ring, it's more than just a pawn in your debt, isn't it? Pyne said slowly, leaning back in his chair, his gaze sharp. It's tied to something far deeper. To these two families, to their business, something that can't be undone. Daphne's eyes flickered, her lips parting slightly as though she had been caught in a lie too big to swallow. I don't know what to do anymore, her voice broke. The money I had, it's not enough to fix everything. The debts are still there, and now this ring, this cursed ring, has trapped me. Naomi wants to reset it, make it hers again, and once she does, once she sees it's been tampered with, she'll... Her voice faltered. Pyne didn't interrupt. He allowed the silence to stretch on, letting Daphne unravel the knot of her own thoughts. She was spiraling, and he knew it. The pressure was mounting in a way that made the stakes higher than she even realized. I thought I could fix everything, that somehow I could right the wrongs, but the closer I get to returning it, the more impossible it feels. Naomi's eyes, they're watching me, Mr. Pyne. They see me, but I can't afford for her to see the truth. Not now. She stood abruptly, her face pale, her breath quickening. I need you to help me, please. Pyne considered her words carefully, then, after a long pause, spoke. So your only option is to find a way to keep the ring hidden, to make sure it never reaches Naomi. You want me to help you hide your crime permanently? Daphne's eyes glimmered with a mix of relief and fear. Yes, exactly. The room was heavy with the weight of her desperation, but the deeper Pyne dug, the clearer it became that the simple theft of a ring was just the beginning. The layers of deceit were suffocating, and the forces at play, business, family, betrayal, were too entangled to separate. This wasn't just a crime to be hidden away. It was the key to something far more dangerous, something that, if uncovered, would destroy everything. But Pyne was a man of solutions, and Daphne had made the right choice in seeking him out. However, as he leaned forward in his chair, his voice colder than before, he added, "But Daphne, to hear is something you need to understand. If we don't get this right, if we don't hide everything, if we don't control every move, we may not just lose the ring. We'll lose everything." He let the weight of his words settle over her. Daphne's pulse quickened. What do you mean? Pyne's eyes narrowed. The question is not if we can hide it from Naomi. The question is who else is watching. And why did this ring, this stolen ring, bring you here to me? What will it cost us to keep this secret safe? Daphne's breath caught. She hadn't considered the danger of having Pyne involved. She'd come to him desperate for help, but she now realized just how deep this rabbit hole went. And then, before she could speak another word, Pyne stood and walked over to the window, looking out over the dimming streets of London. He turned back to her with an expression that could freeze the blood in one's veins. You think Naomi is the only problem. The danger isn't her, Daphne. It's someone far more dangerous, someone who has been watching us both. Daphne's heart skipped a beat. The walls seemed to close in. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Just then, a soft tap echoed on the door. The last thing Daphne saw was Pyne's calculating gazy eyes, narrowing just slightly. He whispered, "We're out of time." The clever plan, Pyne's solution. The room fell silent as Pyne leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in that familiar, thoughtful pose. His eyes, which had seemed distant moments before, were now sharp with the kind of focused brilliance Daphne had heard about but never truly seen. The tension was palpable, but Pyne remained unshaken, as if the entire world could fall apart and he'd still find a way to make it right. "I understand your desperation, Mrs. St. John," Pyne said calmly, his voice steady but filled with the quiet certainty that only he could muster in such moments. "And I am afraid here is no easy way out. But then, that's where I come in." He gave her a slight, reassuring smile, a fleeting hint of a plan forming in his mind. Daphne's gaze flickered to him, her heart racing with uncertainty. "What do you mean? Do you have a solution?" Pyne didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned his chair, a dramatic pause before the storm of his genius hit. His mind worked like a well-oiled machine, his every move calculated, his every word deliberate. He looked out the window, as though he were already envisioning the perfect outcome. "You see, the problem isn't simply the return of the ringle, though that's problematic enough. The problem is how to do it without raising suspicion. If Naomi knows that the ring has been tampered with, everything unravels. What we need is a distraction, something so exquisite, so dazzling, that no one will notice what's happening right under their noses." Daphne blinked, unsure of where he was going with this, but Pyne was already lost in the web of his thoughts. "A distraction?" she asked, hesitant. "But how? Naomi is no fool. She'll see right through anything that doesn't fit with the scheme." "Ah," Pyne said with a sly smile, turning back to her. "But that's the beauty of it. We don't need a distraction, we need a performance, a spectacle. Something that will captivate everyone, distract them, and give us the perfect window of opportunity." He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "And I have just the people for the job." He walked over to his desk, taking out a small, worn notebook, flipping it open to a page filled with names. His finger traced the lines before stopping. "Claude Luttrell and Madeleine de Serra, the finest dancers in London. Their performances are so captivating, so theatrical, that they'll hold everyone's attention as surely as if they were spellbound." Daphne's brow furrowed. "Dancers? You think they'll distract everyone with a dance?" Pyne nodded, his eyes gleaming. "Not just any dance, Mrs. St. John. This will be a grand performance at Lady Naomi's upcoming party. A performance so daring, so unexpected, that no one will dare to look away. It will be an opportune moment for you to make the switch." Daphne's heart fluttered. "But how does this help us? Surely it's too risky to attempt something like that in such a public space." "It's brilliant because it is risky," Pyne said, with a hint of a laugh in his voice. "Imagine it. The ballroom in full swing, people mingling, champagne flowing. And then, in the midst of it all, Claude and Madeleine burst onto the floor, drawing every eye in the room. Their movements will be so exquisite, so unexpected, that the crowd will be held captive. And while they perform, you, Mrs. St. John, will quietly slip the ring into its rightful place without anyone noticing." He paced back and forth, the excitement of the plan building. "You'll need to be precise, of course. You'll have no more than 5 minutes to make the swap. But with the distraction Claude and Madeleine will provide, no one will suspect a thing. The dance will be the perfect cover for your actions." Daphne listened, utterly captivated by the idea. It sounded audacious, but it also sounded perfect. A plan so simple yet so intricate. It was a rare thing to witness such a blend of artistry and precision. "And what happens after the ring is swapped?" she asked, her voice steady with growing resolve. After that, we make sure to leave, Pyne replied, a mischievous glint in his eyes. Once the performance is over, all eyes will be on the dancers, lost in the applause. We'll vanish into the night, with the ring securely returned, and no one the wiser. The plot will be untangled, and your reputation and your debts will be saved. Daphne's eyes widened in realization. She could hardly believe it, but she also knew Pyne had thought of everything. She could see it now. The dancers twirling, the audience mesmerized, and in the shadows she would reclaim what she'd lost. But then, just as she was about to speak, Pyne paused and turned his sharp gaze to her. "Of course," he said coolly, "to hear is always the possibility that someone might be watching. You see, Mrs. St. John, the most dangerous thing about these grand plans is that they often work too well. If we're not careful, we might draw the attention of people we don't want to notice us." Daphne's breath caught. Who else would be watching? Pyne's smile remained, but it was edged with an unsettling calm. "Let's just hope we can pull this off before someone realizes exactly what we're doing." The room seemed to close in as Daphne processed his words. There was no turning back now. This was the only chance she had to right her wrong. But she couldn't help but wonder. Was Pyne as clever as he seemed, or had he just woven an even more intricate web than she could see? Would they make it through the night without being caught? And just as the thought crossed her mind, a soft knock echoed from the door. Pyne's eyes flickered to it, his expression unreadable. "We'll see if we're in time," he murmured. "And Mrs. St. John, let's hope the game doesn't turn against us before it even begins." The night of Lady Naomi Dordheimer's party had arrived, and the atmosphere in the grand ballroom was electric. It was a scene fit for a Parisian gala. The air thick with the scent of fresh flowers, the soft clinking of glasses, and the hushed murmur of high society mingling with one another. Glistening chandeliers bathed the room in golden light, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Yet beneath the polished facade of wealth and elegance, something far more dangerous was afoot. Daphne stood at the edge of the room, her pulse racing as she watched the clock tick down. Pyne's plan was unfolding just as he'd promised, but the tension in her chest refused to dissipate. She wasn't a thief by nature. This wasn't her world, and tonight, the weight of her own deceit felt heavier than ever. The guests seemed oblivious to her anxiety, wrapped up in the spectacle, but Daphne couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that at any moment, everything could go wrong. Across the room, Claude Luttrell, dressed in a sharp tuxedo, stood confidently beside Madeleine de Serres. They were preparing for their performance a carefully rehearsed routine that would serve as the perfect distraction. Claude's role tonight was crucial. He wasn't just any dancer. He was Jules, the legendary dancer everyone had heard of but few had ever seen. His reputation preceded him, and that was the key. No one in that room would dare take their eyes off him. The music began to swell, and the guests shifted in anticipation, eyes turning toward the stage. Lady Naomi, standing near the center of the room, beamed proudly, completely unaware of the plan unfolding under her nose. Pyne, ever the master of observation, was perched in a corner, surveying the room with quiet confidence. His expression betrayed nothing. He knew exactly what was about to happen. He'd orchestrated every moment of this, each detail meticulously designed to work in harmony. The time had come. As the first notes of the waltz filled the room, Claude and Madeleine took to the floor, their movements a perfect blend of grace and passion. The music swirled around them as they glided effortlessly, drawing the eyes of every guest. Claude, or Jules, was utterly captivating. His every movement was a carefully crafted work of art, each step precise yet flowing with an effortless elegance. The crowd was spellbound, their attention entirely consumed by the performance. The lights dimmed. It was subtle at first, a soft fading that seemed almost natural, as if the dimming was a part of the performance, but it was no accident. It was timed, perfectly executed, and everyone was too enchanted by the dancers to notice. Daphne's heart hammered in her chest. Her eyes darted around the room, making sure no one was watching too closely. As the lights continued to fade, a hush fell over the crowd. It was as if time itself had slowed. The music played on, but now it was an eerie, haunting sound, a perfect backdrop for what was about to unfold. In that brief moment of darkness, a small but decisive action occurred. Daphne, with hands trembling but precise, reached into her purse, feeling the cold, reassuring weight of the paste copy of the diamond ring. She slid it discreetly onto Lady Naomi's delicate glass of champagne, now on the edge of a nearby table, as the light shifted again just enough to mask the delicate movement. A barely perceptible exchange. The real diamond, hidden inside the sleeve of her dress, replaced the counterfeit. The sleight of hand was so seamless, so effortless, that even those with the sharpest eyes would have sworn nothing had changed. The real diamond was in her hand now, nestled safely against her palm. Her breath caught in her throat. It's done. It's really done. But as Daphne's fingers curled around the ring, her heart skipped a beat. For a brief second, she thought she saw a flash in the corner of the room, a flicker of movement that didn't belong. A shadow too distinct, too deliberate. She blinked and it was gone, but the feeling lingered. Could it have been nothing? Or was someone watching? The performance reached its crescendo, the dancers twirling in a final flourish. Applause erupted around the room, and with it, a strange, suffocating sense of finality. Everyone was captivated, lost in the wonder of the moment, and for the briefest of moments, Daphne allowed herself to exhale. But as the lights flickered back on and the crowd surged forward to congratulate the performers, something gnawed at her. She had the ring. The perfect heist had been pulled off, no one had noticed. But there was still something unsettling about the way the evening had unfolded. Pyne had warned her, after all, this was a game of high stakes, and it wasn't over yet. She glanced toward the door, where she'd last seen the shadows moving. Her stomach twisted. Had someone caught sight of her? Before she could think any further, Pyne's voice cut through the murmur of the guests, his calm tone somehow more chilling in the midst of the celebration. "Well done, Mrs. St. John. You've played your part beautifully." But as he spoke, his eyes flickered toward the far corner of the room, where a figure in a dark suit stood, watching them both. The figure was too still, too deliberate in its observation. And then, without a word, the figure turned and vanished into the crowd. Daphne's heart skipped a beat. Who was that? Was it someone Pyne had arranged, or was it a shadow of a threat they hadn't accounted for? The perfect plan had worked, or had it? The reveal. Unraveling the truth. The morning light filtered softly through the blinds of Parker Pyne's office, casting long shadows across the polished desk. The scent of fresh coffee lingered in the air as Pyne sat in his usual chair, leaning back with a contemplative expression. The room, once filled with the energy of Daphne's desperate plea for help, was now eerily quiet, as though the calm before a storm had settled over them both. Daphne St. John, or so she had called herself, entered with a sense of relief that should have been palpable, but something was different. The weight in her chest, heavy with the fear of discovery, hadn't lifted. If anything, it had only grown heavier. She held her head high, but her hands trembled slightly as they gripped the edges of her handbag. She had done it. She had pulled off the impossible. The ring had been replaced, the danger averted. Surely her troubles were now over. She felt herself breathe a little easier as she took her seat across from Pyne, ready to hear the satisfaction of a job well done. But Pyne's gaze was sharp, his eyes never leaving hers. There was no congratulatory smile, no sign of relief in his posture. His fingers tapped steadily on the armrest of his chair, as though he was pondering something far beyond the moment. "Daphne," he began, his voice calm but carrying an edge of something that made her pause. "I think it's time we had a little conversation." She shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Something was off. His tone had changed, become more deliberate, and with that, a sense of unease crept in. "You've returned the ring, I presume?" Pyne asked, as if to confirm something she had already thought settled. "Yes," Daphne replied, trying to sound confident, but the words faltered on her tongue. "It's over now, isn't it? No one suspects anything." Pyne leaned forward, placing his fingertips together in a calculated motion. "No, Mrs. St. John," he said slowly. "You see, here is a bit of a problem. The ring you handed me, it was never the original diamond. It was the paste copy." Daphne's breath caught in her throat, her mind racing to process his words. "What do you mean, I swapped it?" Pyne's smile was thin, almost imperceptible. "I know what you thought you swapped it with, but what you brought me was a well-crafted replica. The original diamond, however, is still with you." Her heart pounded as the realization hit her. Her hands went clammy, the blood draining from her face. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught, tangled in her throat. Pyne was watching her with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through her. He leaned back again, his gaze never wavering. "And while we're on the subject of truths, here is something else you should know, Mrs. St. John. Your name isn't Daphne St. John, is it?" She froze, the air thick with the weight of his words. For a moment, everything seemed to blur. The world around her spun, and she could barely focus as she felt the blood rush to her ears. Pyne's voice cut through the fog. "Your real name is Ernestine Richards, isn't it? Secretary to Lady Naomi Dortheimer." The name hit her like a slap to the face. Ernestine Richards. It wasn't just a name, it was a life, a role she had carefully crafted, hiding in plain sight. But now, Pyne had unraveled it all. "You," Daphne whispered, panic rising in her chest. "How did you know?" Pyne smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile one expects from someone offering a solution. It was the smile of someone who had already won. "I know a great many things, Mrs. St. John. Or should I say, Ernestine. You orchestrated the entire scheme, didn't you? You planted the ring, played the role of the desperate woman who needed help. All in an effort to cover up your theft, and to ensure you wouldn't be caught." Daphne's eyes widened, her mouth going dry. The room seemed to close in on her as Pyne's words echoed through her mind. She had thought she was the one pulling the strings, manipulating everyone around her, but Pyne had been the one pulling her into a trap all along. "Everything you told me," Pyne continued, "was a carefully constructed lie. The poor, desperate widow with gambling debts, all fiction. The woman on the run from her past, a carefully rehearsed act. And now, the real diamond still lies within your grasp, hidden beneath layers of deceit." Daphne's heart raced, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She had thought she was escaping her past, but in reality, it had all been a setup. She wasn't the victim, she was the perpetrator, the mastermind of a crime far more intricate than she had ever realized. Pyne paused, watching her struggle to process it all. "I must admit, Ernestine, I never expected this level of manipulation from you. But then again, I suppose I should have known better. It takes a clever mind to pull off a heist like this, and a far more dangerous one to think she could escape her fate." The silence between them stretched on, thick and suffocating, as Daphne's breath grew shallow. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Pyne's voice broke the silence again, cold and final. "I haven't made you happy, as my advertisement promised, but I will make sure that you pay for your crimes, as I promised myself." The finality of his words sent a chill down her spine. She had played the game, but now the stakes were higher than ever. Pyne's plan had worked, and now she was caught in her own web of lies, with no way to untangle herself. Daphne's mind raced, her pulse pounding in her ears. Was there any way out of this? Could she somehow still salvage her future, or had she already sealed her fate? Her world was collapsing, and in the background, Pyne's sharp gaze watched her unravel. The questions hung in the air like a threat. What will happen now? Will she find a way out? Or will she pay the ultimate price for her deceit? The door clicked softly behind her as Pyne stood to leave, his presence hanging heavy in the room. Daphne was left there, alone with her guilt, her tangled lies, and the looming certainty that her life would never be the same again. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken truths as Daphne bolted from Pyne's office, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Her heart pounded in her chest. each beat echoing the same relentless question. How had it all unraveled so quickly? Outside, the world seemed unchanged, bright, bustling, indifferent to the storm that raged inside her. The cool London breeze kissed her cheeks, but there was no relief. The wind only served to remind her of the tangled web she had woven and the consequences that were now closing in on her like an inescapable vice. Her mind raced, a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. She had walked into Pyne's office a woman with a carefully constructed plan, confident that she could manipulate her way out of the mess she had created. But now, she was just a woman exposed, her every lie, every deceit, laid bare for all to see. But what about the diamond? She thought desperately. What about the ring? Pyne may have won today, but surely he couldn't have everything, could he? The weight of her actions began to settle in, a crushing burden that threatened to choke her. It wasn't just about the ring anymore, or even the gambling debts that had driven her to such desperate lengths. It was the realization that she had betrayed herself, that the choices she had made had pushed her further and further into a labyrinth of lies. Her mind flickered to her husband, Henry, the man who, though careful and conscientious, had never truly known her. Could he ever look at her the same way now? Could she ever look at herself the same way? She stopped in the middle of the street, her breath ragged, as if the act of breathing itself had become an effort. She had been so sure that she could outrun her past, that she could fool everyone, including Pyne. But the truth always had a way of finding its way to the surface. It had found her now, and there was no hiding from it. Her footsteps faltered as she recalled Pyne's final words, his tone cold and final. "I haven't made you happy, as my advertisement promised. But I will make sure you pay for your crimes, as I promised myself." The truth, the one thing she had tried so hard to bury, had been exposed, and the consequences were coming. What Pyne would do next, she couldn't be sure. But she knew that the game was far from over. She turned down an alley, her hand trembling as she gripped her purse, her fingers brushing against the smooth edges of the false ring she had so desperately tried to pass off as the real one. Was there still a way out of this? Could she still turn back the clock, undo the mess she had made? The question lingered in her mind, but there was no clear answer. With each step, the past loomed larger, heavier, as if it were waiting for her to confront it. But how could she? How could she ever escape the shadow of what she had done? As the city buzzed around her, Daphne's thoughts remained trapped in the echo of Pyne's voice. She had thought she was the mastermind, the one pulling the strings, but now she was just a puppet tangled in the cords of her own making. And in that moment, she realized something even more terrifying than the guilt itself. Was there any escape from the lies she had built? Could she ever truly be free of the past she had so carefully constructed, or had she sealed her own fate, forever trapped in the labyrinth of her deceit? The question hung in the air like a shroud, unanswered, as Daphne disappeared into the maze of London's streets. For Pyne, the game was won. But for Daphne, the true cost of the truth was just beginning to unfold. Would she find redemption, or was she doomed to live in the shadow of her own lies forever? Only time would tell. But as the day drew to a close, the lingering uncertainty remained. Could anyone, after all, ever escape the consequences of their past? The answer, it seemed, was a far darker question than anyone could have imagined. What would you do if your wife started slipping away, and the only solution was a dangerous gamble? When a desperate husband seeks Parker Pyne's help to win back his cold and distant wife, he's promised a bold solution with one chilling catch. Follow my plan, and you'll have her begging to stay. Fail, and you may lose her forever. As secrets unravel and passions ignite, how far would you go to save a love slipping away? The air in Parker Pyne's office was thick with tension, the faint aroma of old books and polished wood mingling with the metallic tang of unease. Reginald Wade stood by the window, his fingers drumming nervously on the sill. Outside, the muted London streets bustled under a gray sky, but inside, time seemed to stretch painfully thin. He turned abruptly, his polished shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. "I don't know why I am here," he muttered. Though his voice betrayed the truth, he knew exactly why. Parker Pyne sat back in his chair, hands steepled under his chin, watching his guest like a chess master studying the board. His office, lined with shelves of books and curiosities, seemed to hum with quiet authority, the kind of place where secrets unraveled and lives shifted. "You are here because you've exhausted every other option," Pyne said softly, his words slicing through the room like a scalpel. Reginald ran a hand through his hair, his frustration spilling over. "It's Iris, my wife. She's not the same. Cold, distant. It's like I don't even exist to her anymore." His voice cracked slightly, and he clenched his fists, as if trying to crush his vulnerability into submission. Pyne's gaze didn't waver. "And you think T here is someone else?" The question landed like a thunderclap. Reginald hesitated, his jaw tightening. "I don't know. Maybe. It doesn't matter. What matters is I want her back." For a moment, the room was silent, except for the faint ticking of an ornate clock on Pyne's desk. Then, Pyne leaned forward, his eyes glinting with a mix of intrigue and something more enigmatic confidence. "Tell me, Mr. Wade, how far are you willing to go to save your marriage?" Reginald faltered, caught off guard by the directness of the question. "I'll do whatever it takes," he stammered, though a flicker of doubt crossed his face. Pyne smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips that hinted at the layers of the plan forming in his mind. "Good, because this will require precision and patience. But if you follow my advice," he paused, letting the weight of his words sink in, "you'll have your wife begging to stay within a fortnight." Reginald exhaled, relief mingling with apprehension. But before he could respond, Pyne added, his tone now laced with warning, "Or you may lose her forever." The words hung in the air like a verdict, and Reginald's heart thudded against his ribs. Somewhere outside, the church bells chimed, as if marking the beginning of something inevitable. As Reginald finally nodded, agreeing to a plan he didn't fully understand, Pyne leaned back, a faint smile playing on his lips. The game was afoot, and he knew exactly how to play it. Cliffhanger, ****. The camera pans to Pyne's desk, where a file with Iris Wade's name sits open, revealing photographs and notes. The last image shows Iris standing beside a strikingly confident woman, a hint of mischief in her eyes. The first move. The door to Parker Pyne's office creaked open, and in walked Madeleine de Seurat, vision of poise and allure. Draped in an emerald green coat that hugged her silhouette, she radiated confidence, her every movement deliberate and precise. Her dark, mischievous eyes flicked to Pyne, and her crimson-painted lips curled into a knowing smile. "You've always had a flair for the dramatic, Mr. Pyne," Madeleine purred, tossing her coat over the back of a chair and taking a seat as if she owned the room. Parker Pyne chuckled. "And you, my dear, have always known how to command attention." He slid a file across the desk toward her. "This is your assignment, a delicate matter requiring your unique talents." Madeleine opened the file, her eyes scanning the photograph of Iris Wade, a striking woman with an icy elegance that seemed to leap off the page. Madeleine murmured, tapping the photo with a perfectly manicured finger. "The wife. And the goal. To make her realize what she's about to lose," Pyne said simply. Madeleine smirked. "Ah, the oldest game in the book. Very well, this should be entertaining." The next afternoon, Iris Wade was seated on the patio of the Wade's grand country home, a delicate china teacup balanced in her hands. Her composure was as polished as her pearls, but her eyes held a distant, distracted look. When the butler announced a visitor, she barely glanced until Madeleine swept in. "Mrs. Wade," Madeleine's voice was warm, almost effervescent. "I hope you don't mind me dropping by unannounced. Reggie spoke so highly of you. I simply had to meet you for myself." The use of Reggie instead of Reginald was deliberate, and Iris's hand tightened slightly around her teacup. She looked up at Madeleine, her gaze cool and appraising. I wasn't aware my husband had spoken about me to anyone, Iris said, her voice as smooth as the surface of the tea. Madeline's smile didn't waver. She took a seat uninvited, crossing her legs gracefully. Oh, only in the most glowing terms, I assure you. He mentioned you were quite the hostess, and I must say this house is simply exquisite. Her eyes danced around the room, taking in the luxurious yet understated decor. It reflects its owner perfectly. Iris gave a tight-lipped smile. How kind of you. The two women exchanged polite words, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. Madeline's charm was as sharp as a blade, and Iris could feel it pressing against her carefully maintained armor. The tension reached a peak when Reginald entered the room, his expression shifting slightly at the sight of Madeline. "Ah, Madeline," he said, his tone almost too casual. "I see you've met Iris." Madeline stood, her smile brightening. "Oh, we were just getting to know each other. Your wife is remarkable." She placed a hand lightly on his arm, a gesture that appeared innocent, but lingered just enough to make Iris's eyes narrow ever so slightly. "Tea, Madeline?" Iris asked, her tone polite but clipped. Madeline's eyes sparkled with amusement. "Oh, I'd love to, but I mustn't overstay my welcome. Besides, I wouldn't dream of monopolizing your husband's time. It was such a pleasure meeting you, Mrs. Wade." She turned to Reginald, her smile deepening. "See you tomorrow at golf." Reginald nodded, and with a final dazzling smile, Madeline swept out of the room, leaving a trail of tension in her wake. As the door closed behind her, Iris set her teacup down with a deliberate clink. "Golf?" she asked, her voice laced with quiet accusation. Reginald hesitated, then shrugged. "Madeline's an old friend. She's helping me unwind." Iris's laugh was sharp, almost bitter. "Unwind? Is that what we're calling it now?" She rose gracefully, her composure unbroken, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of something jealousy, perhaps, or anger. As she walked out of the room, Reginald remained, staring at the door. Outside, Madeline climbed into her car, her smile fading as she pulled a compact mirror from her bag. Her reflection smirked back at her, full of mischief and calculation. Cliffhanger. **** Back inside. Iris stopped in the hallway, gripping the banister as a thought struck her. Was it Madeline she distrusted, or herself? Key scene: the golf session. The sun was shining just enough to take the bite out of the crisp morning air, casting a golden glow over the perfectly manicured greens of the country club golf course. Reginald Wade adjusted his grip on the driver, squinting at the fairway as Madeline de Serres strolled up behind him. "Careful, Reggie," she teased, her voice lilting with amusement. "You are holding that club like it's a weapon. Golf is about finesse, not brute strength." Reginald laughed nervously, glancing over his shoulder at her. Madeline was dressed impeccably, her tailored golf ensemble hugging her figure in a way that seemed both effortless and intentional. She reached out and lightly adjusted his grip, her fingers brushing against his. "Better," she said, stepping back with a sly smile. "Now don't mess it up." Reginald swung, and the ball sailed farther than he expected, landing neatly on the fairway. He turned to Madeline, grinning like a schoolboy. "Looks like you are good luck." Madeline laughed, a rich, melodic sound that turned a few heads. She clapped her hands lightly and said, "Oh, I am more than luck, Reggie. I am a miracle worker." As she leaned casually on her club, her gaze shifted subtly to the edge of the course, where Iris Wade sat on a wrought iron bench beneath a sprawling oak tree. From a distance, Iris appeared serene, flipping through the pages of a novel, as though she hadn't a care in the world. But her eyes weren't on the book. Every so often, Iris's gaze would flick toward the golf course, lingering just long enough to catch Madeline's playful laughter, or the way her hand lingered on Reginald's arm a moment too long. Iris's fingers tightened on the book's spine. Reginald, oblivious to the storm brewing, lined up for another shot, while Madeline handed him a water bottle with a conspiratorial smile. "You are a quick learner," she said, her voice low. "I might have to keep an eye on you." From her bench, Iris shut her book with a decisive snap. She rose gracefully, her heels clicking softly against the cobblestones as she strolled toward the clubhouse. Her face was composed, but her clenched jaw betrayed the fury simmering just beneath the surface. The confrontation. That evening, the Wade's sitting room was awash in the soft glow of the chandelier. Iris sat on the edge of the velvet sofa, her posture as perfect as ever, but her eyes were sharp, focused on Reginald like a hawk eyeing prey. Reginald, on the other hand, seemed oblivious as he sipped his scotch, recounting the day's game. "You should have seen my drive on the back nine, Iris." Madeline said it was the best shot of the day. Iris's lips twitched, a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. "How delightful," she said coolly, setting her wineglass down on the table with a soft clink. "You and Madeline seem to have a lot to talk about these days." Reginald glanced up, surprised by the edge in her voice. "Well, she's just being friendly. You know how Madeline is." Iris tilted her head, studying him. "Oh, I do. She's very friendly." There was a beat of silence, the kind that stretched too long and felt heavy with unspoken words. Iris rose from her seat, her silk robe flowing around her like a storm cloud. She turned to face Reginald, her composure finally cracking, her voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. "Tell me, Reginald, are you trying to embarrass me?" Reginald blinked, caught off guard. "What? Embarrass you? Of course not. What are you talking about?" Iris stepped closer, her voice lowering but losing none of its intensity. "I am talking about the way you parade her around, laughing at her jokes, letting her touch you like—" She stopped herself, her chest rising and falling as she took a steadying breath. "Do you think people don't notice? Do you think I don't notice?" Reginald set his glass down, his brow furrowing. "Iris, you are overreacting. It's not like that. Madeline's just—" "Just what?" Iris interrupted, her voice rising ever so slightly. "Just amusing herself. Just reminding me how easily my husband can be led by a pretty smile." Reginald opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Iris let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Save it, Reggie," she said, turning toward the door. "If you think she's such a miracle worker, maybe you should ask her to fix your marriage too." She swept out of the room, leaving Reginald alone with his drink and a gnawing sense of guilt. Upstairs, Iris paused at the top of the stairs, gripping the banister tightly. Her heart raced with anger, and something dangerously close to fear. Cliffhanger. Downstairs, Reginald stared at his glass, Madeline's laughter from earlier in the day echoing in his mind. Upstairs, Iris locked her bedroom door, her resolve hardening. Whatever Madeline's game was, Iris wasn't going to let her win. But could she keep her composure as cracks began to form in her once perfect mask? The climax. The cafe confrontation. The streets of London buzzed with life, but Iris Wade barely noticed the cacophony of passing carriages, bustling pedestrians, and distant church bells. She clutched her handbag tightly, her gloved fingers trembling as she stood on the opposite side of the street, staring at the cafe. Through the large glass window, she spotted Reginald. He was seated at a cozy corner table, his head tilted back in laughter. Madeleine de Serres sat across from him, leaning forward, her lips curved in a smile that could only be described as triumphant. Iris's heart pounded in her chest. This was it. Proof that the unease gnawing at her for weeks hadn't been unfounded. She hesitated for a moment, the weight of her emotions pinning her to the spot. But then Madeleine reached out, her fingers brushing Reginald's arm as she whispered something that made him grin even wider. That was all it took. With her head held high, Iris crossed the street, her heels clicking against the cobblestones like a drumbeat heralding an impending storm. The confrontation. The cafe door swung open with a soft chime, and the warmth inside felt stifling compared to the brisk air outside. Madeleine noticed Iris first. Her smile faltered briefly before returning, this time tinged with something smug. Reginald, oblivious, sipped his tea until he followed Madeleine's gaze, his face drained of color. "Iris," he stammered, rising halfway from his seat. "Don't you dare get up on my account," Iris said coolly, though the venom in her voice was unmistakable. She strode toward them, her eyes fixed on Reginald like a hawk zeroing in on its prey. "I wouldn't want to interrupt your little rendezvous." "This isn't what it looks like," Reginald began, his voice cracking under the weight of his guilt. "Oh, spare me," Iris snapped, her composure slipping as her voice trembled with a mix of fury and hurt. "You think I haven't noticed the stolen glances, the secret smiles? And now this." She gestured to the table, her eyes burning. "How long, Reginald? How long have you been making a fool of me?" Madeline leaned back in her chair, her expression shifting from surprise to mild annoyance. "Iris, darling, this is hardly the place for theatrics," she said, her tone condescending. Iris turned on her, her glare sharp enough to cut glass. "And you," she hissed. "You think you are so clever, don't you? Wiggling your way into my life, making me doubt my own husband. But let me tell you something, Madeline de Serra, you are nothing more than a glorified distraction." Madeline's eyes narrowed, and she rose to her feet with an air of defiance. "You know what? I am tired of this petty drama," she said, her voice ringing out loud enough for a few nearby patrons to turn their heads. She grabbed her coat, threw it over her shoulder, and stormed out, leaving Reginald and Iris alone in the middle of the cafe. The truth revealed. Reginald sat back down slowly, running a hand through his hair. He looked up at Iris, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and desperation. "Iris, please. It's not what you think," Madeline was. "I don't want to hear it," Iris interrupted, her voice breaking. She looked away, blinking back tears. "Do you have any idea how it feels to watch the man you love slipping away, to feel invisible in your own marriage?" Reginald hesitated, then reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "Iris," he said softly, "you were never invisible to me. I've made mistakes, big ones, but I never stopped loving you." She stared at him, her heart warring between belief and doubt. "Then why? Why this? Why her?" "It wasn't about her," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was about us. I thought I'd lost you. I didn't know how to fix things, so when Pyne suggested—" "Pyne?" Iris's eyes widened as realization dawned. "Yes," Reginald confessed. "He said I needed to wake you up, that if you saw what you might lose, you'd remember what we have." Iris sat back, stunned. The pieces clicked into place, the subtle changes, the unspoken games, the sudden appearance of Madeline. It had all been orchestrated. Cliffhanger. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them heavy with unspoken truths. Iris's mind raced. She couldn't deny the pain, but she also couldn't ignore the spark of understanding igniting in her heart. Finally, she stood, her voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. "If this was Pyne's grand plan," she said, "then let's see if it worked." She walked toward the door, pausing just long enough to glance back at Reginald. "Are you coming, or are you going to sit here wallowing?" Reginald didn't need to be asked twice. He leapt to his feet, his heart pounding with a renewed sense of hope. As they stepped out into the London night, the tension between them was palpable, but so was the possibility of reconciliation. Unbeknownst to them, Parker Pyne watched from a corner table, sipping his tea with a satisfied smile. His work here was done, but the final chapter of their story was just beginning. The resolution, a fragile reunion. The train ride back to their country home was cloaked in a tense silence. Reggie sat by the window, his fingers drumming nervously on the armrest, while Iris stared straight ahead, her face an unreadable mask. The hum of the train wheels on the track was the only sound between them, and even that felt louder than the words they couldn't bring themselves to say. It wasn't until they reached their doorstep, the familiar scent of lavender from Iris's prized garden wafting toward them, that she finally spoke. "Do you even realize what you've done, Reginald?" Her voice was calm, but eyes carried the weight of everything they had been through. He nodded, his throat tight. "I do, and I know I can't take it back. But Iris, I swear it wasn't about hurting you, it was about saving us." She laughed, a bitter edge to it. saving us by dragging another woman into our lives, by making me feel like I was losing everything. Do you have any idea how that felt?" Reggie's shoulders slumped, and for a moment he looked smaller than she had ever seen him. "I thought I'd already lost you," he admitted. "I didn't know how to reach you anymore. You were so distant, Iris, so cold, and I didn't know if you even cared." Her breath hitched, and she turned away, her hand brushing against the doorknob. "I cared," she said quietly. "I always cared. I just didn't know how to show it anymore." The heart to heart. They stood there in the dim light of their front porch, the evening air heavy with unsaid emotions. Slowly, Iris turned to face him, her expression softer now, tinged with a vulnerability she rarely let show. "Why didn't you just talk to me, Reggie?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why did it have to come to this?" "I didn't think talking would be enough," he said, stepping closer. "I was scared. Scared that if I tried, you'd tell me what I already feared, that you didn't love me anymore." Iris closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they glistened with unshed tears. "I never stopped loving you," she whispered. "But love isn't always enough, is it? Not without trust, not without effort." Reggie reached for her hands, holding them as if they were his lifeline. "Then let's try," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Let's build something better, stronger. I'll do whatever it takes, Iris. Just don't give up on us." A new beginning. For the first time in months, Iris allowed herself to lean into him, her head resting against his chest as his arms wrapped around her. It wasn't perfect, far from it. The wounds were still fresh, the scars still forming. But in that moment, they both felt something they hadn't in a long time: hope. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's embrace, a faint sound broke the stillness, a soft rustling from the bushes at the edge of their garden. Iris stiffened, pulling back to glance toward the sound. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Reggie frowned, his eyes scanning the shadows. "Probably just the wind," he said, though his tone carried an edge of unease. But Iris wasn't convinced. She stepped closer to the garden, her gaze narrowing. "Or maybe," she said, her voice dropping, "it's not over yet." Cliffhanger. As the camera of their lives pulled back, revealing the couple silhouetted against the warm glow of their home, the shadows in the garden seemed to shift, as though something or someone was watching. Somewhere in London, Parker Pyne set down his teacup, his lips curving into a knowing smile. "People are predictable," he mused to himself, leaning back in his chair. "But love always keeps you guessing." What was rustling in the shadows? Was it just the wind, or does the past have more secrets waiting to emerge? Twist ending. The heart's betrayal. The clock in Parker Pyne's cozy London office ticked softly, a steady rhythm against the quiet clink of his teacup. He sat at his polished oak desk, the faint scent of bergamot wafting through the room. The crackling fire added warmth, but the air was heavy with unspoken words. Madeleine de Serres stood by the window, her silhouette framed by the pale winter light. She seemed different, nowhere usual poise slightly faltered, her confident smirk replaced with a hesitant, almost vulnerable expression. "I did what you asked," she said finally, her voice steady but tinged with something unspoken. Pyne didn't look up from his tea. "And brilliantly, I might add. The Wades are on the road to mending their fractured marriage. A success, as always." He smiled, serene and certain. But Madeleine's laugh was bitter, hollow. "Success?" She turned to face him, her arms crossed defensively. "Is that what you call it? Playing chess with people's lives, moving them around like pawns, all for your own amusement?" Pyne raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "You knew what this was, Madeleine. You've done this before. Why does this case trouble you?" Her composure cracked, and she took a step closer, her voice rising. "Because this time I wasn't playing. She paused, struggling to find the words. "I wasn't pretending anymore, Pyne. Somewhere along the way, I started to feel something. For him. For Reggie. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Pyne set his teacup down with deliberate care, the porcelain clinking softly against the saucer. "I see," he said simply. Madeline's eyes narrowed, frustration bubbling to the surface. "That's all you have to say. I fell for a man who was never mine to begin with, and all you can say is I see." Pyne leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled thoughtfully. "The heart," he said, his tone calm and measured, "is the one variable no plan can account for. It doesn't follow logic or reason. It doesn't care for boundaries or consequences. It simply is." Madeline's shoulders slumped, her defiance giving way to exhaustion. "So, what now?" she asked quietly. Pyne stood, his movements deliberate as he approached her. "Now," he said, his gaze unwavering, "you walk away. Because Reggie isn't yours to hold on to, and you knew that from the start. You are not a victim here, Madeline. You are a professional, and professionals know when to step back." She met his gaze, her jaw tightening. "And what about me, Pyne? What about what I feel?" Pyne's smile was faint, almost melancholic. "Feelings are what make us human, my dear, but they're also what make this world so wonderfully unpredictable." The last goodbye. Madeline left the office without another word, the sharp click of her heels echoing down the hall. Pyne watched her go, his expression unreadable, before turning back to his desk. He picked up his teacup, swirling the last dregs of tea, as though lost in thought. Just as he brought the cup to his lips, the phone rang. Pyne answered it with his usual calm. "Parker Pyne," he said smoothly. A voice crackled on the other end, low and urgent. "Tea here is another case. This one's complicated." Pyne's lips curved into a knowing smile. "Complications here are what I live for. Tell me everything." Cliffhanger. As the camera of life pulled back, Madeline's figure disappeared into the bustling London streets. But in her wake, a shadow detached itself from the corner, following her silently, its intentions unreadable. And in the glow of his office, Pyne sat back in his chair, a glint in his eye. "People," he mused softly to himself, "are endlessly fascinating. The game never truly ends." What lies ahead for Madeline? Is her story truly over, or has a new chapter just begun? And who was the shadow in the alley? What happens when a mundane life collides with a deadly secret mission? Brace yourself for a journey of mystery, danger, and betrayal where nothing is as it seems. Mr. Samuel Roberts, a 48-year-old city clerk, had spent the better part of his life shuffling through paperwork and monotonous routines. Each morning he awoke to the same dreary, sightless, cluttered desk, the ticking of the old office clock, the unremarkable hum of city life just outside his window. The spark of adventure, the sense of purpose that once thrilled him, had long since been replaced by an aching emptiness. His life felt as though it were stuck in an endless loop, the same predictable rhythm of work, home, sleep, and repeat. He longed for something more, for a taste of danger, glory, something that would shatter the banality of his existence. It was on one particularly uneventful Tuesday, while nursing a cup of tepid coffee in the corner of the office, that Mr. Roberts first encountered Parker Pyne. Pyne was an enigmatic figure, well-dressed, with a quiet intensity that seemed to simmer beneath his composed exterior. He entered the office with an air of purpose, as though he had a mission, and immediately caught Mr. Roberts' attention. Over the next few days, the two crossed paths more than once. At first, it seemed like mere coincidence. But Roberts quickly realized that Pyne wasn't the type to leave things to chance. There was something in his gaze, a knowing look that suggested he saw straight through the mundane facade of Roberts' life. It wasn't until that fateful evening when Pyne invited Roberts to dinner, promising an evening of discussions that could alter the course of his life, that the real intrigue began. The setting was an elegant, dimly lit restaurant, far removed from the ordinary world Roberts inhabited. As they sipped wine, Pyne's words were carefully measured, each one designed to both soothe and excite. "You've been waiting for something, haven't you?" Pyne's voice was smooth, almost hypnotic. A moment, a chance, to do something extraordinary. To break free from the chains of this dull, predictable existence. I can offer you that. But it's not without its risks. Not everyone comes out unscathed. Mr. Roberts sat there, caught between skepticism and the promise of something more. Could he, the humble city clerk, really embark on such a wild adventure? Would he dare risk everything for something as fleeting as a moment of glory? As if sensing Roberts' hesitation, Pyne leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Roberts with an intensity that made the room feel suddenly colder. I am offering you a chance, Roberts. A chance that could change everything. But, he added with a cryptic smile, be warned, your life will never be the same after tomorrow. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Roberts could feel his pulse quicken, a rush of excitement mingled with a hint of fear. Was this the opportunity he'd been waiting for? Or was it a trap, carefully laid by a man with too many secrets? As Pyne's laughter rang softly in his ears, Roberts knew that, whatever lay ahead, his life had already begun its transformation. What do you think Roberts will do next? Call to adventure. The secret mission. The next evening, Roberts found himself in the same upscale restaurant. But this time, the air was charged with something far more intense. Pyne's calm demeanor had been replaced by an unmistakable tension, as though he were about to reveal a secret too dangerous for ordinary ears. The dim lighting cast long shadows across the table, and as Roberts sat down, he could see that Pyne wasn't alone. Across from him sat a man whose presence seemed to fill the room with an unspoken authority. Mr. Bonington, tall, with a sharp gaze and the kind of voice that commanded attention, was the last person Roberts expected to meet. As they exchanged pleasantries, Roberts couldn't help but notice the undercurrent of urgency in their conversation. Pyne's voice remained cool, but there was an edge to it, something clipped, as if they were speaking in code. Mr. Bonington's responses were curt, his words carefully measured. Roberts, ever the outsider, listened intently, trying to follow the fragments of conversation that floated over his head. The plans are critical, Bonington. We can't afford any more mistakes. The double agent will be in Geneva tomorrow. We can't allow him to get his hands on those documents. Pyne's words came like sharp whispers, each one loaded with unspoken meaning. Robert's pulse quickened. Double agent, secret plans, the vague references to a murder that wasn't in the newspapers were enough to make his heart race. His world, until now so predictable and dull, suddenly felt like it was shifting beneath his feet. He wanted to speak up, to ask questions, but the words stuck in his throat. He had no idea what they were talking about, but he could sense the gravity of the situation. Is Roberts aware of the risks? Bonington's voice cut through the tension like a knife. He wasn't looking at Roberts, but his question was directed at him. No, Pyne replied, his voice low and steady. But he will be soon enough. Robert's mind reeled. What on earth were they talking about, and why was he the one in the room with them? He had no business being part of whatever was unfolding, yet Pyne's calm certainty made him feel like he was already too far gone to back out. A knot of anxiety formed in the pit of his stomach. The world he knew, papers, ledgers, the dull hum of office life suddenly felt miles away, and the pull of whatever Pyne was about to involve him in seemed like a powerful magnet. Roberts, Pyne said, his voice now steely with resolve. You are the one I've chosen for this mission. You may not understand why, but it's not about experience. It's about who you are, and who you will become. The weight of the words hit Roberts like a punch to the gut. He blinked, trying to process what was happening. This was absurd. He was just a city clerk. What did he know about covert operations, murders, or double agents? But Pyne's gaze never wavered, his certainty unshakable. Before Roberts could formulate a response, Pyne slid an envelope across the table, sealing his fate without another word. It was heavy, the paper thick with the promise of something far more significant than a mere piece of correspondence. The label on the front was simple, for your eyes only. It felt like a weighty symbol, a threshold to a world that Roberts had no idea was waiting for him. As Roberts took the envelope, a strange thrill bubbled up inside him, mingled with a sense of dread. Pyne's eyes gleamed as if the moment had already been decided. "Tomorrow," Pyne said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial, "you'll board the first-class sleeper train to Geneva. Everything you need to know is in there. But remember, if you don't follow through, here is no turning back." Roberts nodded mechanically, unsure of whether to feel exhilarated or terrified. The quiet clink of silverware and the hum of voices around them felt distant now. His heart hammered in his chest, and as he stood to leave, he could barely contain the surge of adrenaline that coursed through his veins. Pyne's final words echoed in his mind, a haunting refrain. "Tomorrow, your life will never be the same." The next morning, Roberts found himself at the train station, the envelope still tightly clutched in his hand. He felt the eyes of the city watching him, as though the walls themselves knew that something was about to change. The train to Geneva loomed ahead, a sleek, elegant beast of metal and glass that promised both escape and danger in equal measure. Roberts stepped aboard, each movement slow, deliberate, as if he were stepping into a new world altogether. As the train began to move, he glanced down at the envelope once more, wondering just how deep into the rabbit hole he had fallen. The doors to his compartment closed behind him with a finality that sent a chill down his spine. As the train rattled along the tracks, he opened the envelope, scanning the contents with growing unease. But it was what wasn't written there that unsettled him most, the sense that something, or someone, was waiting for him just beyond the horizon. He wasn't just carrying an envelope anymore. He was carrying the fate of a secret that could unravel everything. Unaware of the true danger ahead, Roberts felt a new sense of resolve settle in his chest. He was already too far in to back out. And somehow, he knew there was no turning back. Cliffhanger. The next morning, Roberts found himself at the train station, the envelope still tightly clutched in his hand. He felt the eyes of the city watching him, as though the walls themselves knew that something was about to change. The train to Geneva loomed ahead, a sleek, elegant beast of metal and glass that promised both escape and danger in equal measure. Roberts stepped aboard, each movement slow, deliberate, as if he were stepping into a new world altogether. As the train began to move, he glanced down at the envelope once more, wondering just how deep into the rabbit hole he had fallen. But before he could open it, a shadow passed by his compartment window. Someone was standing outside, watching him. His breath caught in his throat. Was it just his imagination, or had Pyne's warning already begun to play out? The doors to his compartment clicked shut, the sound echoing in the silence. Roberts hesitated, the envelope still unopened. There was no turning back now. But the question burned in his mind. What exactly had he just stepped into? Rising tension, layers of danger unfold. The train rattled through the darkened countryside, its rhythmic hum a constant companion as Roberts sat, alone in his compartment. The envelope still felt heavy in his hands, an invisible weight pressing down on him. He had read the contents briefly before, but the words cloaked in vagueness and urgency had done little to quell the growing unease swirling in his chest. Pyne's words echoed in his mind. "Your life will never be the same." As the train rolled into Geneva's quiet station in the early hours of the morning, Roberts could feel the tension in the air. The streets were eerily empty, the only sounds coming from the soft tap of his shoes against the cobblestone road as he made his way toward the hotel Pyne had instructed him to find. His senses were on high alert, every flicker of movement or distant voice sending a jolt of anxiety through him. Was he being followed? Had he been seen? The hotel was an old, faded place, a relic of another time, but it was just the sort of place Pyne would choose. The receptionist, a stiff woman with narrow eyes, barely glanced up as he checked in. His room, number 12, was small, overlooking an alley that seemed more suited for shadows than sunlight. Roberts closed the door behind him, his heart racing as he set down the envelope and glanced around. Minutes later, there was a sharp knock at the door. Roberts froze, his pulse quickening. Who could it be? No one knew he was here yet, except for Pyne. And Pyne had been clear that he wasn't supposed to meet anyone until after dark. With caution, Roberts opened the door just a crack. A tall, bearded man in a dark suit stood in the hallway, his face shadowed beneath the brim of a wide hat. His eyes gleamed from behind the scruff of his beard, as if seeing straight through Roberts. "You must be Roberts," the man said, his voice low and gravelly, with a hint of something foreign in his accent. Before Roberts could respond, the man stepped inside, his presence overwhelming the small space. He was carrying a worn leather briefcase that looked like it had seen better days. "The time has come," the man muttered cryptically, before setting the briefcase down on the table. "You've been chosen for a reason, Roberts. You don't know it yet, but you are about to enter a world much darker than you can imagine." Roberts swallowed, unsure of what to say, but his instinct screamed at him to trust nothing, not this man, not the situation, not even himself. Yet, in the very pit of his stomach, he knew that he had crossed a line, and there was no way to go back. The bearded man opened the case, revealing a revolver gleaming and deadly. Roberts stiffened. "You'll need this," the man continued, his gaze never leaving Roberts. "Things are going to get complicated. There are many who would love to see you fail, but there are others who want something far worse. You'll find them, and they'll find you." Roberts took a step back, his mind racing. "What exactly am I supposed to do with this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, even as the revolver felt impossibly heavy in his hands. The man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded map, its edges frayed with age. With slow deliberation, he unfurled it, revealing a series of intricate symbols and cryptic markings that made no sense to Roberts. "This is the map of the Romanov jewels well, what's left of them. Lost for decades, hidden in plain sight, the secrets scattered across Europe." "But here is one catch," the man said, his voice taking on an ominous edge. "The person who holds the map also holds the key to a power beyond their understanding, and those who come for it won't stop at anything to take it." The map was like nothing Roberts had ever seen, a symbol of wealth and mystery, bound to a history that he had no right to touch. But Pyne had chosen him. Pyne had said he would be a part of something grand, something that would change him forever. Was this it? Just as Roberts processed the weight of what he had been thrust into, the bearded man leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "The others are already watching. Don't trust anyone, especially not the woman you'll meet soon. She's part of the game, and she'll try to deceive you. Remember this, trust no one, not even Pyne." With those final, chilling words, the man stepped back and grabbed the briefcase, snapping it shut with a finality that sent a chill down Robert's spine. "You have until midnight," the man said, pausing at the door. "Get to the rendezvous. The clock is already ticking." Before Roberts could react, the man vanished into the dimly lit hallway, leaving Roberts standing in his room, reeling from the sudden turn his life had taken. His fingers still gripped the revolver tightly, but his mind was spinning with questions. Cliffhanger. As the man disappeared, Robert's gaze fell to the map again. The cryptic markings, the jewels, none of it made sense, yet it was becoming clear that he was now entangled in something far larger than he could have ever imagined. Suddenly, a soft knock came at the door. Robert's heart skipped a beat. Was it the man, or someone else? He cautiously approached the door, hesitating before slowly opening it, only to find the hallway empty. But lying at his feet was a small, folded note, hastily scrawled with one chilling line. "They know you are here. Trust no one." Robert's breath hitched as he looked down the empty corridor. The game had begun, and he was already a pawn in a much larger plot. The foreign beauty. As the train to Paris sliced through the French countryside, Roberts could barely keep his thoughts in order. The weight of the revolver, the cryptic map, and the strange warning from the bearded man felt suffocating. He stared out the window, watching the rolling hills blur past, trying to grasp the reality of the situation he had found himself in. It seemed absurd, too impossible to be real, but every moment confirmed it wasn't a dream. It was when the train entered a long, dark tunnel that Roberts first noticed her. She stepped into the compartment with the silent grace of a woman accustomed to moving unnoticed. Her entrance was subtle, like a whisper in the dark, but once she stepped into the light, it was impossible to ignore her. She was stunning, tall, elegant, and draped in an aura of old-world glamour. Her dark hair framed her face in soft waves, and her wide, almond-shaped eyes, full of suspicion and fear, darted nervously from side to side. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was arresting. "I am sorry," she said suddenly, her voice breathless, as if she had just run a great distance. "Is this seat taken?" Roberts barely managed to shake himself from his stupor and nodded, gesturing for her to sit. "No, please, Before he could finish, she slumped into the seat opposite him, her gaze scanning the compartment with the vigilance of a cornered animal. Roberts felt an instinctive shiver crawl down his spine. Something about her jittery energy, the way she couldn't seem to stay still, told him she was running from something. Someone. "Thank you," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. She then leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking with his, her expression unreadable. "Here is no time. They'll find me soon." Roberts frowned. "Who's looking for you?" Her lips pressed into a tight line. She glanced quickly out of the window, and when she spoke again, it was in a voice thick with fear. "A Russian agent. He's been following me for days. He won't stop until he finds me." Robert's heart rate quickened, his earlier confusion now replaced by the sharp sting of adrenaline. This wasn't just a random encounter. No, this woman was caught in something much bigger than he could understand. "What do you want from me?" he asked, unable to disguise the edge of suspicion creeping into his voice. The woman's gaze softened for a moment, her fear momentarily giving way to a flash of vulnerability. "I am not sure you have a choice," she replied, her voice steadying slightly. "But you are the only one I can trust." Before Roberts could ask another question, the compartment door slid open with a creak. The woman froze, her eyes wide with terror. A man stood in the doorway, tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing the unmistakable coldness of a trained agent. His expression was neutral, his eyes scanning the room as if he already knew exactly what he was looking for. Robert's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not like this. The man's eyes flicked to Roberts, then back to the woman, and in that brief moment of tension, the woman moved faster than Roberts could process. She reached into her bag, pulled something small and rolled tightly in silk, and shoved it into his hands. "Protect this with your life," she whispered, her voice trembling. Roberts instinctively took the bundle, his fingers brushing against her soft skin for just a second before she vanished, slipping out of the compartment before the man could even react. He was left standing there in stunned silence, the weight of the bundle pressing into his palms. His heart was pounding, and for a moment, he couldn't even bring himself to look at it. But then, curiosity mingled with a growing sense of danger pushed him to unroll the delicate fabric. Inside, there was nothing but a small, intricately carved wooden box. It was light, almost weightless, and yet it felt as though it held the weight of 1,000 secrets. As he stared at it, trying to comprehend what had just transpired, the door slammed open, and the Russian agent stepped into the room, his eyes locking on Roberts with deadly intent. "Where is she?" the man demanded, his accent thick, his hand reaching for the holster at his side. Robert's blood ran cold. His mind screamed for him to move, to do something, but his body refused to obey. The agent's gaze shifted to the bundle in Robert's hand, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. Had he already given it to her? The agent took a step closer, but Roberts still hadn't moved. His hand wrapped around the revolver, the weight of the gun suddenly feeling too real. Cliffhanger. "Who are you?" Roberts asked, his voice hoarse, his grip on the small box tightening. The Russian agent smiled cold and knowing. "You are in far too deep, Mr. Roberts," he sneered. "But don't worry. I'll make sure you never see her again." Just as the man reached out, Roberts acted. With a sharp breath, he shoved the box into his jacket pocket and stood, his hand gripping the revolver, ready for whatever came next. Before he could pull the trigger, the agent lunged, and Roberts was plunged into a game of survival that had only just begun. The night of peril. Action and deception. The train rocked gently as it glided through the French countryside. But for Roberts, it felt like the world itself was shifting beneath him. His fingers trembled around the revolver, the small box still hidden deep in his coat pocket. The moment the woman had vanished, disappearing as silently as she had appeared, was the moment everything spiraled into chaos. The air in the compartment now felt thick with unease. It wasn't just the rush of adrenaline or the scent of the revolver. Something was wrong. And then he heard it. A muffled scuffle. The sound of something being violently pushed, a chair scraping against the floor. The unmistakable thud of a body falling. Roberts whipped around, his heart in his throat, eyes scanning the dimly lit room. But there was nothing, no sign of the woman, no sign of struggle, nothing except the sudden, overpowering smell that hit him like a wall. Chloroform. He barely had time to react before a wave of dizziness swept over him. His vision blurred, the edges of his consciousness blurring as if everything was happening underwater. He fought it, clawing at his senses, refusing to collapse into the fog of unconsciousness. His hands reached for his face, and in a desperate frenzy, he held his breath, trying to stay awake. But it was too late. With a gasp, Roberts staggered forward, the room spinning wildly. He reached the door of the compartment, barely able to steady himself. When he yanked it open, the scene that greeted him nearly made his stomach churn. The woman gone, the compartment empty, the faint trace of chloroform lingered in the air, thickening the tension, and in that moment, Roberts realized what was happening. This wasn't a random kidnapping. This was orchestrated. The Russian agent, the mysterious figures on the train, all of it was part of something much bigger. There was no time to lose. Roberts stumbled down the narrow train corridor, the pounding of his heart drowned out by the chaotic rattle of the train's wheels. He had to find her. He had to rescue her. His only lead, the small bundle she had left behind now, felt like his only lifeline. Suddenly, his instincts kicked in. He saw him. The Russian agent, the one who had been tailing him earlier, stepped out of a nearby cabin. Roberts froze, the weight of the situation sinking in. He had to act fast. He couldn't let this man see him. Not now. A plan began to form in Roberts' mind. He had no choice but to take a risk. It was reckless, but there was no alternative. In an instant, Roberts ripped the conductor's hat off a passing train employee and shoved it on his head, adjusting his posture to mimic the stiff, authoritative stride of a rail conductor. His heart thudded against his ribs, but he kept his face neutral, his expression guarded. He couldn't let his nerves show, not now. He made his way to the next compartment, where the Russian agent had disappeared into a moment earlier. The door slid open with an audible click, and Roberts stepped inside, breathing shallowly, maintaining the facade of a composed conductor. To his surprise, the cabin was dark, and for a moment he thought he had made a mistake. But another, tied to a chair in the far corner, was the woman. Her eyes fluttered, barely open, but when she saw Roberts, a flicker of recognition crossed her face, a silent plea for help. She was bound tightly, but alive. Roberts wasted no time. The door clicked shut behind him as he moved swiftly to her side, his hands working with frantic precision to untie the ropes. His heart pounded so loudly in his chest that it nearly drowned out the sound of her soft, labored breaths. "Stay quiet," he whispered urgently, glancing around the room, making sure no one was watching. But just as the final knot unraveled, the door exploded open with a force that sent Roberts flying backward. The Russian agent, furious and relentless, stepped into the room, his eyes blazing with menace. The man's hand was already reaching for his weapon, his cold expression telling Roberts everything he needed to know. This wasn't just a chase anymore. This was a fight to the death. The woman gasped, her eyes wide with terror. As Roberts scrambled to his feet, there was no time to think. He had to protect her. He had to get them out of here. But as Roberts moved to shield her, a loud bang echoed through the train, an unmistakable sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Cliffhanger. The Russian agent raised his gun, aiming directly at Roberts. The woman screamed, but before the shot could be fired, the cabin door slammed shut. The unmistakable sound of pounding fists against wood filled the air. "We're trapped," Roberts hissed, his voice tight with panic as he quickly scanned the room for an escape. A single, desperate thought raced through his mind. He had one chance. One final chance to escape. And then the door splintered under the force of the blows, and Roberts knew the moment of truth was upon them. With the agent outside, pounding against the locked door, Roberts could only pray that the daring escape he'd been planning would be enough to save them both. Chase across Paris. A game of cat and mouse. Paris, the city of light, had turned into a labyrinth of shadows, its charming streets now a maze of danger and deceit. Roberts and the woman dashed through the narrow alleys, their breath ragged in the chill night air, their footsteps echoing in the silence that surrounded them. Every corner they turned, every shadow they passed, seemed to conceal yet another danger lurking in the darkness. The winding streets of Paris had become a trap, a deadly game in which they were both the hunted and the hunters. The woman now revealed as Olga, though Roberts was still unsure of her true identity, was ahead, her heels clicking against the cobblestones. Roberts pushed himself harder, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to keep up. He couldn't lose her. With every passing second, their pursuers were closing in. "Faster," Olga urged, glancing over her shoulder. Her face was pale, the fear in her eyes unmistakable. But she didn't stop running, even as a black car with tinted windows rolled slowly by, its occupants scanning the street. Roberts barely had time to react before they were forced to duck into another alley, the oppressive weight of the night closing in on them. The shadows seemed to move, following them, as if the city itself were conspiring against them. But the worst part, the unshakable feeling that they were being watched not just by the men in the car, but by something or someone else, someone who knew the game better than they did. Their flight took them deeper into the heart of Paris, away from the famous landmarks, and into the forgotten corners where the city's dark underbelly came to life. And it was in those alleys that Roberts started to feel the true weight of their predicament. Trust had become a fragile thing. The woman had revealed little about herself, and Roberts knew nothing of her past, but there were glimpses of something deeper, something haunting. She was more than she appeared, and Roberts couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something, something that could make or break them. As they reached an old courtyard, the woman finally slowed, her eyes darting nervously around. She grabbed Roberts by the arm and pulled him into a secluded corner. The tension between them was thick, as if they both knew their lives depended on the next few words. "I never wanted to drag you into this," Olga said, her voice trembling, but she stood tall, facing him with newfound resolve. "But you must understand, this isn't just about a jewel or a conspiracy. It's about blood, my blood, my blood." Roberts blinked, unsure if he'd heard her right. "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath and glanced over her shoulder, as if making sure no one was following. "I am the last of the Romanov bloodline." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of history. "There are people who would kill to erase every trace of my existence, to bury the truth forever." Robert's mind raced as the enormity of what she was saying sunk in. The Romanovs, the royal family of Russia, had been murdered decades ago, their legacy thought to be wiped out. But now, here she was, claiming to be their last living heir. And someone, a powerful someone, was hunting her. Before Roberts could digest this new information, a shadow loomed ahead. They were not alone. A cold voice broke the stillness, cutting through the night like a knife. "You should have stayed out of this, Roberts." He spun around, and there, in the flickering light of the courtyard, stood one of their pursuers, a mantle, cloaked in a dark overcoat, his eyes cold and calculating. He was flanked by two others, their movements stiff and deliberate, like trained hunters. They were closing in. Olga's face drained of color. "We have to move, Ano." They took off again, running through the narrow streets, their pursuers not far behind. Every turn, every alley felt like another step closer to being trapped. Roberts could feel his chest tightening, the weight of the situation sinking in. They couldn't outrun them forever. But then a thought struck him. If they could make it to the airport, to the planes leaving Paris, maybe, just maybe, they could escape. The chase led them to the train station, but they were forced to cut across to the airport to avoid being cornered. They ducked into a terminal just as the final boarding call echoed through the loudspeakers. The woman, terrified yet determined, grabbed Robert's arm. "We're almost there," she whispered. "We can get out of this. We just need to reach that plane. We can disappear." They rushed toward the gate, the final moments of their freedom hanging in the balance. But as they approached the check-in counter, Robert's heart nearly stopped. There, standing at the boarding gate, was one of the shadowy figures from the alley. He was unmistakably a tall man with a stoic expression, dressed in a sleek suit. He was boarding the same plane they had planned to escape on. Roberts froze. Cliffhanger. A cold shiver ran down his spine as he locked eyes with the man. Olga's grip on his arm tightened, and for a fleeting second, Roberts considered making a break for it. But it was too late. The man had already spotted them. He gave a brief, knowing nod. "It's too late," Olga muttered under her breath. "They found us again." Robert's pulse quickened as the realization hit him. No matter where they went, no matter how far they ran, the pursuers were always one step ahead. And now, with one of them boarding the plane, Roberts knew that the stakes were higher than ever. They weren't just running from a conspiracy anymore, they were running for their lives. The door to the plane was closing, and Roberts knew that the next few moments would determine whether they would survive or fall into the hands of the enemy. The grand finale, unmasking the truth. The sprawling estate loomed ahead like a silent sentinel, its stone walls draped in ivy and shadows. Roberts, still clutching the mysterious stocking, felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had been running for days, barely sleeping, always looking over his shoulder. And now, here he was standing at the gates of a grand country manor, the very last place he expected to be. As the gates swung open, Roberts stepped onto the manicured grounds, his heart racing with both anticipation and dread. The letter, the cryptic instructions, the endless chassis had all led him here. But to what end? What was waiting for him inside? He had no answers, only a gnawing sense that everything was about to change. He was met at the door by Count Stepani, a tall, imposing man with a chiseled jaw and eyes that seemed to pierce through him. The Count's presence was as intimidating as the manor itself, yet his smile was disarmingly polite, almost charming. "Ah, Mr. Roberts," he said with a deep voice that echoed slightly in the grand hallway. "I trust you've had a fascinating journey." Roberts nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. He was here to deliver the stocking, nothing more. But a strange feeling had begun to settle in the pit of his stomach. Everything about this felt off. The Count's impeccable politeness, the grandiosity of the house, it all seemed too perfect, too orchestrated. And then, the door at the far end of the room opened, revealing a woman dressed in a lavish gown, her face veiled in shadow. "Ah, here she is," Count Stepani said, gesturing toward the woman with a flourish. "The Grand Duchess Olga." Roberts couldn't help but feel a sense of disbelief. The woman before him, tall and elegant, had all the makings of someone royal. Her regal posture, the fine details of her attire, even the way she moved it screamed aristocracy. And yet, something didn't add up. There was a slight twitch in her eye, a nervousness she tried to mask. She extended a hand to Roberts, her fingers adorned with sparkling jewels. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you," she said, her voice smooth, but with an underlying edge of tension. Roberts hesitated only for a moment before taking her hand. Something about her felt both familiar and foreign, like a character in a play that he couldn't quite place. And then, as if by instinct, he glanced at the stocking still clutched in his other hand. "Your Highness," he began, "I was given a message to deliver this, from Mr. Pyne." The Duchess Olga smiled faintly, a mysterious glint in her eyes. "Ah, Mr. Pyne," she murmured. "The man who sees everything, who controls everything. A fascinating individual." Before Roberts could reply, there was a flicker of something in her gaze. It was subtle, but it was enough. A brief hesitation, a slight stammer, as if she were about to say something but caught herself at the last second. Robert's heart skipped a beat. Something wasn't right. Then, as if to confirm his suspicions, the woman spoke again. "I've been waiting for this moment. Everything is falling into place now." But just as she said that, a crack in her polished facade appeared. Her voice faltered, the regal air slipping for just a moment. "I mean, this will be quite the performance." Roberts froze, the pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicking into place. He stared at her, confusion and realization dawning in equal measure. Performance. The word echoed in his mind. He had heard that voice before, heard that exact phrase. But it wasn't a duchess, it was Maggie Sayers. Roberts muttered under his breath, the name coming to him like a bolt of lightning. The woman, oh, the actress, smiled a wicked smile, the mask slipping away completely. "Oh, you are clever, Mr. Roberts. Too clever for your own good," she said, her voice now dripping with sarcasm. "Indeed, I am Maggie Sayers, hired by Pyne himself to play the part. The royal heir, merely a ruse, a bit of theater to keep you on your toes." The revelation hit Roberts like a punch to the gut. The woman he had believed to be the key to everything, the mysterious royal, was nothing more than an actress. And what was worse, she had been in on the entire scheme from the start. "And the stocking?" Roberts asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Just a prop," she replied nonchalantly, "to keep you busy, to keep you running, to make you believe you were part of something bigger than you really were." The room seemed to spin as Roberts tried to process this new layer of deception. The chase, the constant threats, the run in it had all been part of the game. But the true twist came when he looked at the Count. Stephanie was smiling now, his posture relaxing as the charade unraveled. "You see, Mr. Roberts," the Count said, stepping forward, "while you played hero, chasing shadows across Europe, the secret plans, everything Pyne promised, you were already safely transported elsewhere. All you were doing was running in circles, a convenient distraction." Roberts felt a sickening wave of betrayal wash over him. The treasure, the jewel, the conspiracy, everything had been a smokescreen. He had been a pawn all along. Cliffhanger. As the room around him seemed to close in, Roberts' mind raced. How had he been so blind? How had he missed the signs? The game was over, he had been outplayed. But as the Count and Maggie exchanged a knowing look, a single chilling thought struck him. Who was Pyne really working for? Before he could voice his question, the sound of a door creaking open echoed from the far end of the room. A figure stepped into the light, their face hidden in shadow. A voice, cold and familiar, spoke. "Did you really think it was over, Mr. Roberts?" The room held its breath, and Roberts knew with a sickening certainty that the game had just entered its final, most dangerous phase. Satisfying resolution, glory found. The days following the storm of deception and chaos were quieter than Roberts had ever imagined they could be. The noise of the chase, the clamor of uncertainty, and the constant rush of adrenaline had faded into a distant memory. Now, in the solitude of his small apartment, a strange sense of calm had settled over him. He had been handed an unexpected prize, but it came with a lingering taste of confusion and uneasiness he couldn't quite shake. The jewel-encrusted case, its surface gleaming in the dim light of his sitting room, sat before him on the table. The case was more intricate than anything Roberts had ever seen, its craftsmanship elegant and mesmerizing. But it wasn't the case itself that held his attention. It was the check tucked neatly inside, bearing the promise of £50, an amount that seemed absurdly small compared to everything he had been through, yet it was a symbol of something far more elusive. A reward. For a moment, Roberts let his fingers trace the fine edges of the case. It was a token of his triumph, a reminder of the role he had played in a story that had seemed to defy all logic. He had been part of something so much larger than himself, a secret mission, a hidden conspiracy, a world of danger and intrigue. And now here he was, a man who had survived it all, clutching his reward in a quiet room far from the chaos of Paris, Geneva, and the train that had started it all. He settled into his armchair by the fireside, the gentle crackling of the fire offering a strange sense of comfort. The flames flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and Roberts, for the first time in what felt like forever, allowed himself to relax. He opened the novel resting on the table beside him, a book he had meant to read for years, and let the familiar, mundane words wash over him. It was a peaceful moment, an ordinary moment, in stark contrast to the whirlwind of excitement that had dominated his recent life. But as he read, his mind kept drifting back to the adventure. The faces of the people he had encountered, the secrets he had uncovered, the games that had been played at his expense, all of it seemed distant now, almost dreamlike. The winding paths of danger and deception had led him to this point, but Roberts couldn't help but wonder if there was more to the story, if there were layers he had yet to uncover. He looked down at the case again, then at the check, feeling the weight of it in his hands. The life he had returned to, the life that once seemed so dreary and predictable, now felt somehow more vibrant. The humdrum days of filing papers, attending meetings, and sitting through long hours at the desk no longer held the same dullness. His quiet life had been forever altered, not by the grand treasure or the thrilling encounters, but by the memories of what he had faced. But with that new perspective came questions that gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. Was it all real? Had it truly happened the way it seemed, or was it a carefully constructed illusion, a performance designed to pull him into a web of intrigue for reasons unknown? Had Pyne's game been nothing more than a long con, a fabrication from the very start? And what of the people he had met, the actress posing as the Grand Duchess, the mysterious agent, the shadowy figures in the alleys? Who were they really? Were they players in a much larger scheme, or mere actors in a performance meant to keep him guessing? Roberts leaned back in his chair, staring into the flickering flames, and for a moment he couldn't help but smile. The firelight reflected in his eyes, a hint of amusement playing on his lips. After everything, the chase, the danger, the twist, she had come out victorious. But there was one thing that remained unsolved, one question that continued to linger in the back of his mind. Had it all been real? Or was it simply a dream, a carefully constructed illusion created for a man who craved excitement and glory? As the pages of his novel turned slowly in his hands, Roberts couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't truly over. Something was still unfinished, some thread left dangling in the winds of uncertainty. Perhaps, just perhaps, his greatest adventure was yet to come. Cliffhanger. The fire crackled louder, snapping Roberts from his thoughts. He glanced at the window where the faintest shadow passed by the curtains, too swift to be seen clearly. A cold chill ran down his spine as he set the book aside and stood up. The shadow lingered just outside, almost as if it was waiting for him to notice. He stared at the door, his heart pounding. What if the real game had only just begun? Imagine this. You have everything you've ever dreamed. Wealth, status, luxury beyond compare. But late at night, staring at your own reflection, you can't help but wonder, why do I feel so empty? Now, what if someone approached you with a life-altering proposition? I can take your soul and place it in another body. You can leave all of this behind, start over, truly free. But you can never go back. What would you do? The screen cuts to black. A sharp gasp echoes as we see a glamorous woman, Mrs. Reimer, gazing intently into a mirror, her diamonds catching the light. Her eyes reveal a mix of sadness and longing. The sound of a clock ticking grows louder, building tension. Suddenly, she jolts awake, but she's no longer in her opulent mansion. Instead, she's lying in a simple farmhouse bed, the morning light streaming through a worn curtain. Her surroundings are unfamiliar, rustic, and strangely comforting. A voiceover draws the audience further in. This isn't a dream. This isn't science fiction. This is the extraordinary tale of a woman who gave up everything she had to discover the one thing she truly needed: happiness. The visuals shift between contrasting scenes. Mrs. Rymer sipping champagne at a lavish party, surrounded by strangers with fake smiles, then struggling to carry a basket of fresh eggs on a foggy farm, her laugh echoing in the open air. The transition is stark, jarring, and magnetic. As the clock ticks down to the end of the segment, the narrator asks, "What price would you pay to escape a life that feels like a cage? Could you leave behind the comfort of riches for the uncertainty of freedom?" This is the story of Mrs. Rymer, and her answer might surprise you. The screen lingers on her hesitant yet hopeful expression as she looks out over a quiet field, the promise of something new just beyond the horizon. The tension is palpable, the questions unshakable. The audience is hooked. Meet the client. The story shifts to a grand, silent estate. A chandelier glitters in the dim light, and the sound of echoing footsteps breaks the stillness. Mrs. Rymer sits in a lavish parlor, her perfectly manicured hands clasping a glass of sherry. Her face, though adorned with fine makeup, reveals something deeper: a loneliness that no wealth can mask. Not long ago, this was a woman whose laughter echoed through sunlit fields, who found joy in simple things. But life has a way of turning dreams into gilded cages. A flashback paints her origins: a young farm girl with dirt-streaked cheeks and a wide, unguarded smile, tending to chickens and racing through golden meadows. Her world changes the day she meets Abner Rymer, a kind-hearted but ambitious engineer. He speaks of inventions and prosperity, of a future brighter than the stars. They marry in a modest church, her dreams tied to his promises of a better life. Cut to a montage. Abner's success soars, and so does their wealth. Factories rise, money flows, and their lives transform. Yet, as the years pass, the couple's laughter fades, replaced by silence in their sprawling mansion. The narrator continues. Abner built an empire, but he could not build a bridge back to the woman he fell in love with. When he passed away, he left her everything, except the one thing she truly needed. Back in the present, Mrs. Rymer stares out the window, watching raindrops slide down the glass. Her voice breaks the silence. "I thought I'd be happy. Isn't that what wealth is supposed to bring? But I've never felt more alone." The camera pans to reveal Parker Pyne sitting across from her, his expression calm but curious. He leans forward slightly, his voice low and enigmatic. "Happiness, Mrs. Rymer, isn't bought. It's found, and sometimes you have to lose everything to find it." Her eyes narrow, skepticism flickering. "And what exactly are you offering me?" she asks, her tone sharp but laced with a hint of hope. Pyne's response is measured, almost cryptic. "A chance to escape, to remember who you were, who you are. But it will cost you." Mrs. Rymer hesitates, torn between fear and curiosity. Her voice wavers as she whispers, "How much?" Pyne's smile is faint, his answer unsettlingly vague. "Not in money, Mrs. Rymer, in trust." The scene ends with Mrs. Rymer staring into the fireplace, the flames dancing in her eyes. The faintest trace of a smile appears on her lips, or perhaps it's just a trick of the light. The audience is left wondering, will she take the leap, and what will it cost her in the end? Her current state: wealthy but miserable. The camera pans through the halls of Mrs. Rymer's grand estate. Marble floors glisten under the soft glow of crystal chandeliers. Priceless artwork hangs on the walls, and antiques are arranged with meticulous precision. Yet, The house feels cold, lifeless, a museum instead of a home. Mrs. Reimer sits in her vast dining room, a solitary figure at the end of a long, polished table. A butler pours her wine, but she waves him off with a tired sigh. The table is set for one, the silence almost deafening. Her eyes linger on an untouched meal as she mutters to herself, "What's the point of all this?" The narrator's voice cuts in. She had everything money could buy: jewels, mansions, even a yacht named after her. But what use are riches when that here is no one to share them with? Flashbacks of her life play out. Glamorous parties filled with elegant guests, but all with forced smiles. Hollow laughter echoes as champagne glasses clink. Friends who once fawned over her now drift away when the invitations stop. The narrator continues. For Mrs. Reimer, wealth had become a cage. It kept her safe, but also kept her alone. A knock breaks the silence. Mrs. Reimer's butler announces, "A Mr. Parker Pyne is here to see you, madam." She glances up, curiosity flickering. "Send him in," she says, her tone equal parts disinterest and intrigue. The camera shifts to Parker Pyne entering the room. He's not what she expected. No flashy suit, no eager smile, just a calm, steady presence that seems to fill the room. He takes a seat across from her without waiting for an invitation, his demeanor quietly confident. "Mrs. Reimer," he begins, his voice soothing yet firm, "you've come to me because something is missing." She stares at him, her guarded expression softening ever so slightly. "I don't know how to enjoy my life anymore," she admits, her voice trembling. "I've tried everything. Nothing works." Parker leans forward, his eyes piercing but kind. "Happiness," he says slowly, "is closer than you think, but it will cost you." Her brows furrow in suspicion. "Cost me? I've already paid dearly for the life I have. What more could you possibly ask for?" Pyne's faint smile reveals nothing. "Not in money, Mrs. Reimer. In trust." The room falls silent, tension thick in the air. Mrs. Reimer's fingers tighten around her glass. The flickering firelight dances in her eyes as she considers his words. Finally, she asks, "And if I don't trust you?" Pyne rises, buttoning his coat with an air of finality. "Then you'll remain exactly where you are." He begins to walk away, but her voice stops him. "Wait." She stands, her gaze steady but uncertain. "Tell me what I need to do." Pyne turns, his enigmatic smile returning. "Are you ready to leave it all behind?" The screen fades to black, leaving the audience teetering on the edge of curiosity. What will she choose? What lies ahead in this mysterious offer? And most importantly, what will it truly cost her? Experiment begins. Mrs. Reimer's trembling hands hovered over the checkbook, her heart racing as she hesitated to pen her name. £1,000, a staggering amount even for someone as wealthy as her. Yet the promise of something beyond the emptiness she felt pushed her forward. With a final shaky exhale, she scrawled her signature, sealing her fate with the stroke of a pen. Parker Pyne's eyes gleamed as he pocketed the check. "You won't regret this," he said, his voice smooth yet cryptic. "What lies ahead will change your life forever." Mrs. Reimer's curiosity clashed with unease. She had always been in control, dictating the terms of her life. But now she was surrendering herself to the unknown, entrusting her soul to a man who called himself a happiness consultant. Pyne led her through a discreet door at the back of his opulent office. It opened into a narrow hallway illuminated by dim, flickering lights. Shadows danced along the walls, creating an atmosphere thick with mystery. Mrs. Reimer's heels clicked against the polished floor, each step pulling her deeper into this enigma. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Pyne glanced back, his expression unreadable. "To the place where transformation begins." The hallway opened into a room unlike anything Mrs. Reimer had ever seen. Heavy drapes in deep shades of crimson and gold framed the space. The scent of exotic spices hung in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of incense. A low, steady hum of musicer was enchanting, added to the surreal ambiance. Two figures emerged from the shadows. "Mrs. Reimer, meet Nurse DeSarah and Dr. Constantine," Pyne announced, gesturing to the pair. Nurse DeSarah was tall and imposing, her piercing eyes giving the impression she could see right through a person. Dr. Constantine, on the other hand, exuded an eerie calm. His thin frame and serene smile might have been reassuring under other circumstances, but here, in this strange room, it felt almost sinister. Dr. Constantine stepped forward, his voice a soft murmur. "Your sickness is not of the body, Mrs. Reimer. It is of the soul, and tonight we shall begin its cure." Mrs. Reimer's breath hitched. The words hung in the air, charged with foreboding. Before she could respond, Nurse DeSarah approached with a steaming cup of coffee. Its aroma was rich, almost intoxicating, but there was something unsettling about the way she held it as if it were a sacred chalice. "Drink this," Nurse DeSarah commanded, her voice low and firm. Mrs. Reimer hesitated, staring at the dark liquid swirling in the cup. "What is it?" "A passage," Pyne interjected, his voice cutting through her doubt. "To the life you've always dreamed of." Her fingers curled around the cup, its warmth seeping into her skin. As the room seemed to close in around her, she brought it to her lips and took a sip. The taste was bitter, almost medicinal. Her vision blurred, and a wave of dizziness washed over her. What's happening?" she slurred, the cup slipping from her grasp and shattering on the floor. The world around her tilted, the faces of Pyne, Nurse DeSarah, and Dr. Constantine blending into a kaleidoscope of light and shadow. The last thing she heard before darkness claimed her was Pyne's voice, calm and deliberate. "The journey has begun." And then, silence. What awaited Mrs. Reimer on the other side of consciousness? The answer was shrouded in mystery, leaving only one certainty: nothing would ever be the same again. The room was drenched in an air of foreboding, a dim amber light casting long shadows across the walls adorned with intricate oriental patterns. The flicker of candlelight revealed strange, ceremonial objectionate vials, ancient scrolls, and a mirror with a frame that seemed to pulse faintly, almost alive. The air was thick with the heady aroma of incense, sharp and sweet, as if masking something darker beneath. Dr. Constantine entered with a deliberate calm, his voice a measured melody that sent chills down Mrs. Reimer's spine. His dark eyes bore into hers as he uttered the words, "Your sickness is not of the body, but the soul." The sentence hung in the air, heavy with a meaning she couldn't yet grasp. Nurse DeSarah, standing silently in the corner, handed her a small porcelain cup of coffee. The liquid inside was darker than night, its surface unnaturally still, as though it resisted the laws of nature itself. Mrs. Reimer hesitated, the cup trembling slightly in her hand. She glanced at Dr. Constantine, searching for reassurance, but his expression remained unreadable, a mask of detachment that offered no comfort. "What happens if I drink this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You will understand," he replied cryptically, tilting his head as if observing a specimen. "Or you will not. Either way, the journey begins here." The room seemed to close in on her, the flickering shadows growing larger, more oppressive. She felt the weight of their gazes, not just the people in the room, but something unseen, something lurking just beyond the edge of perception. The walls, once static, seemed to breathe, the oriental patterns twisting subtly, forming shapes that disappeared the moment she tried to focus on them. Steeling herself, Mrs. Reimer raised the cup to her lips. The bitter liquid burned as it slid down her throat, leaving an aftertaste that was both metallic and sweet. Her vision blurred almost instantly, the room warping and spinning as though she were caught in a vortex. She heard a distant hum, a sound that grew louder and more distorted, transforming into a cacophony of whispers. Her limbs grew heavy, her head swayed, and she felt herself slipping, falling. Darkness enveloped her, but it wasn't silent. Echoes of laughter, faint and eerie, danced around her. A voice, Dr. Constantine's, or was it someone else? Whispered in her ear, "What lies ahead is not for the faint of heart." And then, silence. The screen fades to black, leaving the audience on the edge of their seats, desperate to know, what has she just done? What is waiting for her in the void? A new life. Mrs. Reimer jolts awake, the faint smell of hay and earth filling her nostrils. Instead of her silk-sheeted bed, she finds herself lying on a creaky wooden frame with a scratchy quilt. The room is stark and unfamiliar, a far cry from the opulence she once called home. Her heart races as she sits up, scanning the peeling wallpaper and the single cracked window letting in the morning light. "Where am I?" she whispers, her voice trembling. A knock at the door startles her, and a middle-aged woman in a plain apron walks in carrying a steaming cup of tea. The woman's face is kind but weathered, her expression calm yet unreadable. "You are awake, Hannah," the woman says with a small smile, setting the tea down on the rickety nightstand. "How are you feeling?" "Hannah." Mrs. Reimer's voice is sharp, panic rising. "Who's Hannah? And who are you? What is this place?" The woman, who introduces herself as Mrs. Gardner, looks at her with a mix of patience and pity. "Oh, Hannah, don't be silly. You've lived here for years. You had a bit of a fainting spell yesterday, but you are back now." Mrs. Reimer's eyes dart around the room, landing on a framed photograph of a smiling young woman on a farm. Her face. Her hands tremble as she picks it up, recognizing the girl in the photo as herself but younger, dressed in overalls and standing next to a barn. "I don't understand," she murmurs, her voice barely audible. This isn't real." But the shocks are far from over. Mrs. Gardner sets down a folded newspaper on the small table. The bold headline catches Mrs. Reimer's attention instantly. "Wealthy widow Mrs. Reimer declared insane. Estate frozen amidst investigation." Her breath catches in her throat as she reads the article detailing her supposed mental breakdown and institutionalization. According to the piece, she had been spiraling for months, speaking incoherently about her dissatisfaction with life and vanishing without a trace. Her thoughts race. Have I been tricked? Is this some elaborate punishment? Or could this truly be my life now? She presses her hands to her temples, overwhelmed by the impossibility of it all. Her heart pounds as questions flood her mind. Who orchestrated this, and why? As tears well up in her eyes, she looks at Mrs. Gardner, who seems unshaken, even expectant. The screen fades to black, leaving the audience with the looming question: what really happened to Mrs. Reimer, and how far will she go to uncover the truth? The journey back. The sun hangs low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the vast expanse of the farm. Mrs. Reimer, now known as Hannah, stands in front of the weathered farmhouse, the scent of fresh hay and earth mingling in the air. She's no longer the refined lady of the city, but a humble woman of the land. Her fingers, once accustomed to silk and pearls, now grasp the rough wood of a shovel, digging into the soil with surprising ease. Every day she wakes up to the simple rhythm of farm life: early mornings, the smell of fresh bread, the sound of hooves against the dirt, and the unspoken comfort of her new routine. At first it felt like a strange dream, living without the pressure of society's gaze, the glittering distractions of her past life now distant memories. But as the days pass, she begins to find solace in the simplicity of it all. She watches Joe Welsh, the farmhand, expertly tending to the animals. Here is something about his easy confidence, his quiet nature, that draws her in. He doesn't ask questions about her past. He doesn't need to. Here is an unspoken understanding between them, and with each passing day, she feels herself letting go of the woman she once was. Her hands, calloused now, no longer tremble with doubt or fear. But then, as the evening approaches and the sky deepens into a shade of indigo, the weight of her dilemma settles in. Should she stay as Hannah? The woman who has found unexpected peace in the solitude of the farm. The woman who is learning to laugh again, who is rediscovering the joy in simple things. Or should she return to her old life, the life that promised glamour, luxury, and a place in society's highest echelons? She pauses, watching Joe as he quietly whistles while tying the fence. Here is an undeniable pull to him, an intimacy forged through shared moments of silence. But what would he think if he knew the truth? What if he knew she wasn't Hannah, but a woman on the run from a past she couldn't outrun? Her thoughts spiral. What if no one believes me? What if this is where I truly belong? The question claws at her chest. Just as she begins to make sense of her confusion, the farmhouse door creaks open. A figure steps into the fading light, a man she doesn't recognize. His eyes meet hers, and for a moment, time stands still. Then, with a look of recognition, he speaks. "I knew I'd find you here, Mrs. Reimer." Her heart skips a beat. The past she thought she had buried so deep suddenly resurfaces. This man, he knows her. But how? And why is he here? The wind picks up, swirling dust around her feet. She feels the ground beneath her shift, the weight of her decision pressing harder than ever. She takes a step back, heart pounding, as the man takes another slow, deliberate step forward. "You are not safe here," he says, his voice low and urgent. "They're still looking for you." The silence between them feels suffocating, and just as the words sink in, she hears footsteps behind her. Joe. The look on his face is one of confusion and concern, but she can't afford to explain. Not now. Not when everything she's built here, every fragile hope, might be ripped away in an instant. What happens next? Does she face the past she's been running from? Or does she make the hardest choice of all, to stay as Hannah, to walk away from the life she thought she knew? As the man's hand slowly reaches for the pocket of his coat, the world feels like it's closing in on her. Will she be forced back into the life she ran from? Or will she finally embrace her new beginning? The choice is hers, but the consequences may be more than she can bear. The door creaks open once more. What happens next? The confrontation. The sun dips below the horizon, casting long shadows over the farm, the quiet hum of evening settling in. Mrs. Reimer, or rather Hannah, has long since grown accustomed to the rhythm of this life, the tranquility, the simplicity, the sense of belonging. The days pass by in a haze of hard work and quiet moments with Joe, and the world feels, for the first time in years, safe. But safety, it seems, is an illusion. It happens in an instant. One moment, the farm is calm, just the wind and the rustling of leaves, and the next, here is a presence at her back. A figure, out of place in the serene landscape, standing near the gate. She turns, and her breath catches in her throat. It's him, Pyne. She'd thought he was long gone, erased from her life, just another shadow of her past. But there he is, standing in the fading light, wearing that same composed smile, the one that had once masked everything she thought she wanted. "What are you doing here?" Her voice is tight, her hands clenching at her sides, the farm's peaceful facade cracking under the weight of his unexpected appearance. Without warning, anger bursts from her. "You deceived me. You promised me a life away from all that." Her words come out in a rush, her chest heaving with the intensity of the emotion she's held in check for so long. "You took everything from me, and now you show up like nothing happened." Pyne remains unmoved, his expression calm as always, as if he's seen this all before, as if he's expected it. "You wanted happiness, didn't you?" His voice is low, almost soothing, as if he's the one offering comfort. He steps forward, each movement calculated and precise. "And I gave it to you. No one was ever meant to know the truth." His words hit her like a physical blow. "What are you talking about?" Her mind races, trying to piece together what he's saying. Could it be true? Had he been manipulating her all along? "The life you have now," he continues, his voice eerily composed, "your money, your freedom, untouched. Your life, in fact, is better than ever. You've found peace here, haven't you? You've found something you didn't know you were missing." She stands frozen, the reality of his words settling in like a bitter pill. He's right. Her life here has been far simpler than it ever was before. But was it enough? Had she really traded one cage for another? Had she unknowingly exchanged one set of chains for another, all in the name of happiness? Then the ultimate question, the one that cuts through everything. "Are you happy now, Mrs. Reimer?" Pyne asks, his eyes locked onto hers with unnerving intensity. The silence hangs thick in the air, and in that moment, the world seems to stop. It's the question she's avoided for so long, the one she's never dared to answer. Because if she admits the truth, everything will change. It will mean she's been living a lie, a life that never really belonged to her. For a long, agonizing moment, she stands there, struggling with the weight of his question. Her past, her future, everything she's come to care for here, everything seems to hang in the balance, suspended by a thread too thin to grasp. Finally, the words come, soft, barely audible, but enough to break the silence. "Yes, I am." Her admission is quiet, but in the stillness of the evening it feels like a thunderclap. The truth, out in the open. But just as Pyne's smile widens in acknowledgement, a shadow moves in the distance, a figure, approaching fast. Someone else is here, and they've been watching the entire conversation. Her heart races. Who is it? The air around her shifts, the calm shattered in an instant. "Then the game has just begun," Pyne says, his smile deepening, his eyes flickering to the newcomer. "Welcome to the real test, Mrs. Reimer. You are about to find out just how much you've truly gained." Before she can react, the figure steps into the light, and it's someone she never expected to see again. Someone from her past. Someone who could ruin everything. The story is far from over. What happens now? The satisfying conclusion. The night is quieter than ever, the stars scattered across the sky like tiny diamonds, casting their soft glow over the land. Mrs. Reimer Hannah stands by the fence, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. In front of her stands Pyne, calm as always, but this time here is something different in the air. The tension, thick and suffocating, feels like it could snap any second. She had thought she was ready to walk away from it all. But the truth is, she's not running from her past anymore, she's running towards something far more meaningful. The past, with its lies, its wealth, its empty promises, is gone. What she has now is real. Joe, the farm, the simple life she's built with her own hands. But what about the money? She swallows hard, then turns to Pyne, her voice steady but filled with a quiet resolve. "I want £700, she says, her words surprising even her. But they feel right. "I want to buy a small farm, one that Joe and I can call our own. No more schemes, no more secrets, just us, building the life we've dreamed of." Pyne watches her with a kind of unreadable gaze. For a moment, it seems like he might argue, or perhaps mock her decision. But instead, his lips curl into that same knowing smile, the one that always made her question everything she thought she knew. "Happiness isn't about what you have," he says softly, his voice carrying a weight that feels almost final. "It's about what you feel." For the first time in her life, Mrs. Reimer feels the truth of those words settle deep within her. The life she's chosen isn't about money, or the power she once wielded. It's about the quiet moments working the land beside Joe, laughing over simple meals, finding peace in the rhythm of their days. It's a life that's real, grounded, and free of the empty promises that once defined her existence. She takes a deep breath, glancing at Pyne one last time. "You've given me what I needed," she says, her voice soft but certain. "And now I am choosing my own path." Pyne tilts his head, almost in acknowledgement, before turning to leave. But before he disappears into the night, he pauses, as if a final thought has crossed his mind. "You've made your choice, Mrs. Reimer," he says, "but remember, even the simplest of lives can hold the darkest of secrets." The words hang in the air, but before she can respond, he's vanished into the shadows from which he emerged. And just like that, the weight lifts. For the first time in a long time, she feels free. As the stars twinkle above her, she turns to Joe, who's watching her from the porch. His expression is one of quiet contentment, his love for her evident in every glance. No more questions, no more doubts. They've chosen this life together, and that's all that matters. She walks toward him, the soft earth beneath her feet grounding her, the sound of their footsteps the only thing breaking the silence. Together, they stand beneath the vast sky, hand in hand, ready to embrace the future. But before she can step inside, a shadow falls across the doorframe. A figure, distant yet familiar, watches them from the edge of the farm. Her heart skips a beat. Could it be? The figure steps forward, the soft crunch of gravel underfoot, and then, in a voice she recognizes all too well, they speak. "Did you really think you could escape everything? Would she ever truly be free?" What happens next? The past has a way of catching up, and it seems Mrs. Reimer's peace may be more fleeting than she imagined.